sold to the highest bidder. Have you ever watched injustice happen in broad daylight and done nothing? In 1887 Kansas, an entire town stood silent as four orphaned sisters were dragged to an auction block by their own uncle, about to be sold separately to settle his gambling debts. The law allowed it. Society accepted it. But when a widowed rancher named Caleb Whitmore rode into town and saw children treated like livestock, his fury ignited a battle that would shake the foundations of a broken system. This is the story of four girls who refused to be broken, and the man who bet everything to prove that family isn't bought, it's chosen. Before we begin, if you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this story moves you, hit that like button. Now let's go back to that autumn day when everything changed. The wind that swept through Millbrook, Kansas that October morning in 1887 carried the scent of coming winter and the sharp edge of injustice. Main Street stretched dusty and worn between buildings that had weathered too many hard seasons, their paint peeling like old skin, their wooden facades gray with neglect. The town had that exhausted quality common to places where hope came in small measures and left just as quickly. But today, the street buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with hope. A crowd gathered in the town square, circling a makeshift platform built from scrap lumber and propped against the side of the general store. Men in work-worn clothes stood with arms crossed, their faces carefully blank. Women whispered behind gloved hands, their eyes bright with the kind of curiosity that comes wrapped in horror. Children peeked between adult legs, sensing something terrible in the air, but not yet understanding its shape. On that platform stood four girls. Eliza Moore was 17, tall and thin as a fence post, with dark hair pulled severely back from a face that might have been pretty if it weren't so gaunt. Her gray eyes swept the crowd with a wariness that suggested she'd learned early not to trust kindness from strangers. Her calico dress, faded from too many washings, hung loose on a frame that hadn't seen enough food in too long. She held her sisters close, arranging them like a shield against what was coming. Margaret, 14, pressed against Eliza's left side, her auburn hair catching the weak sunlight. She had their mother's fine features and their father's stubborn jaw, and right now both were set in an expression of barely controlled terror. Her hands trembled as they gripped the fabric of Eliza's dress. On Eliza's right, 10-year-old Catherine stood with the unnatural stillness of a child who'd learned that invisibility might equal safety. Brown-haired and serious, she stared at her worn shoes as if the scuffed leather held answers to questions she was too frightened to ask. And in front of them all, barely visible behind Eliza's protective stance, 6-year-old Ruth clutched a rag doll with one hand and her oldest sister's skirt with the other. Golden curls framed a face still round with childhood, eyes wide and confused, not yet comprehending that the world could be this cruel. Their uncle, Vernon Hayes, stood to the side of the platform, sweat beading on his florid face despite the autumn chill. He was a thick man gone to fat, with the broken capillaries of a heavy drinker spiderwebbing across his nose and cheeks. His suit, once fine, showed the stains and wear of a man sliding steadily downward. His eyes wouldn't quite meet anyone's gaze directly, sliding away like oil on water. Next to him, thin and official in a black coat that had seen better days, stood the auctioneer, a man named Pettigrew who'd sold everything from farm equipment to foreclosed homes, and now, apparently, had no qualms about selling children. "Folks," Pettigrew called out, his voice carrying that practiced cadence of men who make their living from other people's desperation. "We're here today on a matter of legal business. Mr. Vernon Hayes, as legal guardian of his late brother's children, has the right under Kansas law to determine their placement and care." Legal. The word sat heavy in the air, a stone dropped in still water. Eliza's jaw tightened. Legal didn't mean right. She'd learned that bitter truth in the 6 weeks since her parents had died. Her father crushed beneath an overturned wagon, her mother following 3 days later from fever and a broken heart. She'd learned it when Uncle Vernon had arrived at their small farm, wearing false sympathy like an ill-fitting coat. She'd learned it when he'd sold everything her parents owned, pocketed the money, and claimed it was for their care. She'd learned it last night when he'd told them, drunk and belligerent, exactly what he intended to do. "These girls need proper homes," Pettigrew continued, though his tone suggested he was reciting words he didn't quite believe. Mr. Hayes, in his generosity, has agreed to facilitate their placement with families who can provide for them. Generosity. Another word that twisted meaning into something unrecognizable. Vernon Hayes owed money all over town, to the saloon, to card sharps who'd taken him for everything he had, to men with hard eyes who didn't appreciate late payments. The girls represented his last liquid asset, and he'd use them to settle his accounts. "We'll start the bidding with the eldest," Pettigrew announced, gesturing toward Eliza. "Strong girl, capable, can cook, clean, work a garden. 17 years old, plenty of good years left in her. Like livestock, like a horse, or a plow, or a piece of farm equipment." A man near the front of the crowd raised his hand. Silas Turnbull, who owned the boarding house at the edge of town. He was 60 if he was a day, with a wife buried 5 years back and a reputation for working his help harder than his horses. $50, he called out. Eliza's stomach dropped. She knew what $50 meant. 3 years of indentured servitude at minimum, likely more. She'd be worked until she was too worn to be useful, then cast aside. 60, came another voice. A woman this time, Mrs. Eldridge from the millinery shop. She needed someone to work in her shop, and everyone knew she paid in room and board rather than wages. Margaret's grip on Eliza's dress tightened until her knuckles went white. "Now hold on," Vernon Hayes interjected, his words slightly slurred even this early in the day. "We're selling them separate, not as a set. 4 girls, 4 sales. That's what we agreed, Pettigrew." That's right, the auctioneer confirmed. "Each girl will be placed individually, ensuring they all find appropriate homes." "No." Eliza's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, clear and hard as iron. "You can't separate us." Every eye turned to her. A few people had the grace to look ashamed. Most just looked uncomfortable, as if her resistance was an inconvenience rather than a plea. Vernon Hayes' face flushed darker. "You don't have a say in this, girl. I'm your legal guardian, and I'll do what's best." "Best for your gambling debts, you mean?" Eliza shot back, and gasps rippled through the crowd. "Everyone here knows you're broke. Everyone knows you've drunk away everything our father left. You're selling us to save your own skin." "That's enough!" Vernon lunged toward the platform, but Pettigrew caught his arm. "Let's keep this civil," the auctioneer said quietly, though his eyes had gone cold. He turned back to the crowd. "Do I hear 70? 75, Turnbull called out, his gaze fixed on Eliza with an intensity that made her skin crawl. 80, Mrs. Eldridge countered. The bidding continued, numbers climbing while Eliza stood frozen, watching her future, watching all their futures, being decided by strangers who saw them as solutions to problems, as labor to be exploited, as anything except human beings who'd already lost everything. Catherine was crying now, silent tears streaming down her pale face. Ruth had buried her face in Eliza's skirt, her small body shaking. Margaret stood rigid, her breathing shallow and fast, on the edge of panic. $100! The shout came from the back of the crowd. A rancher named Dalton who ran his operation with brutal efficiency and a string of workers who never stayed long. "And I'll take the 14-year-old too. Save everyone some time." Vernon Hayes' eyes lit up with the desperate gleam of a drowning man spotting driftwood. "Now, that's a generous offer. Like hell!" Eliza's voice rang out again, louder now, edged with something wild. "We stay together or you get nothing. I'll run. I swear I'll take my sisters and run so far you'll never find us." "You'll be hunted down and brought back," Vernon snarled. "And when you are, I'll make sure you're placed somewhere you'll regret that threat." The crowd shifted, uncomfortable now. This wasn't how these things were supposed to go. The objects being sold weren't supposed to fight back, weren't supposed to make people face what they were participating in. Sheriff Coleman, who'd been standing at the edge of the square looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, cleared his throat. "Miss Moore, you're not making this easier on yourself." "I don't care about easy," Eliza said, and her voice broke just slightly on the last word. "I care about keeping my family together. Our parents are barely cold in the ground, and this man," she pointed at Vernon Hayes, "wants to scatter us to the four winds for gambling money. How is that legal? How does the law allow this?" "The law allows a guardian to make decisions for minor children," Coleman said quietly, and he had the decency to look pained by it. I'm sorry, but that's the way it is. The law's a damn fool then, someone muttered from the crowd, and a ripple of agreement followed. But agreement didn't stop the auction. Sympathy didn't change the law, and Vernon Hayes was already nodding to Pettigrew to continue. If we could please resume, the auctioneer began. That's when the sound of hoofbeats echoed down Main Street. A single rider, moving at a pace too fast for town limits, the horse's hooves kicking up dust that glowed golden in the slanting morning light. Heads turned. The auction paused. Even Vernon Hayes stopped his eager calculation to see who was coming. The horse was a big bay gelding, well cared for and powerful. The man in the saddle sat easy despite the speed, his body moving with the horse like they were parts of the same creature. As he drew closer, Eliza could see he was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that had seen work but was well maintained. His hat shadowed his face, but she could make out a strong jaw set in hard lines. He pulled up at the edge of the crowd, dismounted in one smooth motion, and the people parted for him without quite meaning to. There was something in his bearing, not aggression exactly, but a kind of solid presence that suggested he was used to being listened to. Caleb Whitmore was 38 years old, and looked like he'd earned every year of it. His face was weathered from sun and wind, creased at the eyes and mouth in ways that suggested he'd seen his share of both laughter and pain, though the pain had won out lately. Dark hair shot through with gray fell to his collar beneath his hat. His eyes, when he lifted his head, were the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and currently hard as granite. He'd been a widower for 2 years. His wife Sarah had died bringing their first child into the world, and the baby had followed her within hours. The ranch he ran was successful by anyone's measure, but success meant nothing when you came home to an empty house every night and the silence pressed down like a physical weight. He'd come to town for supplies, running late because a fence had needed mending. He'd heard the commotion from 2 streets over and came to see what the fuss was about. What he saw made his blood run cold. What in God's name is happening here? His voice carried across the square, quiet, but with an edge that cut through the murmuring crowd. Pettigrew drew himself up, trying for authority. Private business, Mr. Whitmore. A legal proceeding. Legal? Caleb's eyes swept the platform, taking in the 4 girls huddled together, the fear on their faces, the protective stance of the oldest. His gaze moved to Vernon Hayes, and something in his expression made the other man take an involuntary step back. You're selling children. Placing them, Pettigrew corrected. Mr. Hayes is their legal guardian and has the right. I know Hayes, Caleb interrupted, his attention still fixed on Vernon. I know he drinks more than he works and owes money to half the county. I know his brother, these girls' father, wouldn't have trusted him with a barn cat, let alone his children. Vernon's face purpled. Now, you listen here. No, you listen. Caleb moved closer to the platform, and the crowd gave him room. Tom Moore was a good man, a decent man. He worked himself to death trying to build something for his family. And now you're selling his daughters like livestock to cover your gambling debts? It's legal, Vernon repeated, but his voice had gone shrill. Legal. Caleb repeated the word like it tasted bitter. He looked around at the assembled crowd, neighbors, townspeople, people he'd known for years. You're all just going to stand here and watch this happen? You're going to let this piece of... He bit off the word, jaw working. Let this man sell 4 orphaned girls separately to whoever bids highest. Shame flickered across several faces. Sheriff Coleman shifted his weight, hand moving to his belt, but not to his gun. It's the law, Caleb. I don't like it either, but what? But you'll enforce it anyway? Caleb's voice had gone quiet again, which somehow made it more dangerous. When did we stop being human beings and start being just followers of words written in some book somewhere? That's how civilization works, Pettigrew said pompously. Laws and order. This isn't civilization, Caleb said flatly. This is cruelty with paperwork. Eliza found herself staring at this stranger who'd ridden in like something out of the dime novels Margaret used to read. He was angry. She could see it in every line of his body, in the tight control he was exercising over himself. But his anger wasn't directed at them. It was directed at the situation, at the system, at the injustice of it. It was the first time in weeks anyone had been angry on their behalf rather than at them. "The auction's going to continue," Vernon announced, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Whitmore, if you're not here to bid, I'll thank you to move along." Caleb turned to look at him, and Vernon actually flinched. "Oh, I'm bidding," Caleb said softly. "What's the current offer?" Pettigrew glanced at his notes, thrown off balance. $100 for the two eldest girls." $2,000, Caleb said. The crowd went silent. $2,000 was more than most families in Millbrook made in 5 years. It was a fortune. Vernon Hayes' eyes went wide. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Pettigrew actually took a step back, as if the sheer magnitude of the number had physical force. 2,000? Vernon finally managed. "That's what I said." Caleb's expression didn't change. "But I have one condition." "What condition?" Vernon was already calculating, already seeing salvation from his debts, already tasting the whiskey he'd buy with the money. "I take all 4 girls," Caleb said. "Together, not separated. All of them or the offer's off the table." Eliza's breath caught. Margaret's grip loosened slightly. Catherine looked up for the first time, hope warring with terror in her young face. Ruth peeked out from behind Eliza's skirt, her ragdoll clutched tight. Vernon didn't even hesitate. "Deal! Pettigrew, write it up. 2,000 for all 4. Hold on," Sheriff Coleman interjected. "Caleb, you sure about this? 4 girls, that's a lot of responsibility. You're out there alone." "I know exactly what I'm doing, Jim," Caleb said quietly. "The question is whether you do." The sheriff's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. "If everyone's agreed." "We're agreed," Vernon said quickly, already reaching for the money he could almost taste. "Draw up the papers." The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of legal language and signatures. Caleb produced a bank draft. Apparently he'd been about to buy breeding stock and had come prepared for a major purchase. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the same money meant for cattle was now buying children's freedom. Vernon Hayes signed away his guardianship rights so fast his pen nearly tore the paper. He grabbed the bank draft, verified its authenticity with hands that shook slightly, and fled before anyone could change their minds or ask uncomfortable questions about what kind of man sold his brother's children without a backward glance. The crowd dispersed slowly, people drifting away with the guilty shuffle of witnesses who'd almost participated in something they'd regret for the rest of their lives. And then it was just Caleb and the 4 girls on the platform, with Sheriff Coleman and Pettigrew hovering nearby to ensure everything was legally proper. Caleb looked up at the sisters, and for the first time, his expression softened slightly. "My name's Caleb Whitmore. I have a ranch about 10 miles outside town. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'm not exactly sure what I just did, but I know I couldn't walk away and let you be sold separately." Eliza studied him, trying to read the intentions behind his eyes. She'd learned in the past weeks that kindness often came with strings attached, that generosity usually expected repayment. "What do you want from us?" It was a blunt question, maybe even rude, but she was past caring about propriety. Caleb met her gaze directly. "I want you to be safe. I want you to stay together. Beyond that," he shrugged, "I haven't thought that far ahead." "You just spent $2,000, Eliza said. "Nobody does that without expecting something in return." "Fair enough." Caleb rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly looking tired. "The truth is, I've got a ranch that runs well enough but could use help. If you're willing and able, there's work. If not, we'll figure something else out. But I'm not going to work you to death, and I'm not going to separate you. That's a promise." "Promises from strangers don't mean much," Margaret said quietly, speaking for the first time. "No," Caleb agreed. "They don't. I guess you'll have to see if my actions match my words. Right now I'm offering you a place to stay, food to eat, and the chance to stay together. If that's not acceptable, tell me now, and I'll find another solution." Eliza looked at her sisters, Margaret, scared but trying to be brave, Catherine still crying silently, Ruth, who'd started to peek out from behind her skirt with cautious curiosity. They'd been through hell. They'd nearly been separated and sold to people who would have used them up and thrown them away. This stranger was offering them, what? Safety? Hope? A different kind of prison? but it was also the only offer that kept them together. "We'll go with you," Eliza said finally. "But if you hurt any of them, if you break your promise, I'll find a way to make you regret it." Caleb's mouth quirked slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "I'd expect nothing less. Now let's get you off this platform. You've stood up here long enough." He offered his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Eliza took it. His grip was warm and calloused, the hand of someone who worked with his body, and not just his words. He helped each sister down in turn, treating even little Ruth with the same careful respect. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. "I'll file the guardianship transfer papers tomorrow. Everything's legal and binding. Vernon can't come back and try to reclaim them." "He won't," Caleb said with quiet certainty. "Men like that don't come back once they've got what they want." They walked to where Caleb's horse waited, the big bay gelding standing patient and calm despite the chaos. Caleb looked at the four girls, clearly doing calculations in his head. "This is going to be tight. Ruth, you'll ride with me. Eliza, Margaret, Catherine, you'll have to share the saddle behind us. It's only 10 miles, but it'll be uncomfortable." "We've been uncomfortable before," Eliza said. The ride out of town was silent, except for the sound of hooves on packed dirt and the creak of leather. People watched from doorways and windows, but no one called out or tried to stop them. The girls clung to the saddle and each other, still not quite believing what had happened. They'd woken up this morning as property about to be auctioned. Now they were in the custody of a stranger who'd paid a fortune for them and claimed to expect nothing in return. Eliza didn't believe in miracles or convenient rescue. She'd learned that life didn't work that way, but she believed in being practical, and practically speaking, Caleb Whitmore represented their best chance at staying together. Everything else, they'd figure out as they went. The ranch, when it came into view, was bigger than Eliza expected. A 2-story house, solid and well-maintained, stood at the center of a cluster of outbuildings. Barn, stable, smokehouse, several others she couldn't immediately identify. Fencing stretched into the distance, enclosing pastures where cattle grazed. The whole operation spoke of prosperity and careful management. It also looked terribly lonely. Caleb dismounted and helped the girls down. Ruth stumbled slightly, her legs stiff from the ride, and he caught her easily. "Careful there." They stood in an awkward cluster in the yard, 4 dusty, exhausted girls and one rancher who'd just upended his life, in a moment of righteous fury and was now facing the consequences. "Right," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "Let's get you settled. The house has 4 bedrooms upstairs. They're not being used. You can take your pick, or share if you'd rather. Kitchen's through there, water pumps out back. I imagine you're hungry." "We haven't eaten since yesterday," Catherine said quietly. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Of course you haven't. Come on." He led them into the house, and despite everything, Eliza found herself noticing details. The place was clean but sparse, with the bare-bones functionality of a space that was inhabited but not lived in. No curtains on the windows, no decorations, furniture that was practical and nothing more. The house of a man who'd stopped caring about comfort when he lost the person who made home mean something. Caleb moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling out bread, cheese, cold chicken, apples. It was simple food, but there was a lot of it, and he laid it out on the table without ceremony. "Eat. I'll show you the rooms after." The girls fell on the food with the desperate hunger of people who'd gone too long without enough. Caleb watched for a moment, his expression unreadable, then turned away to give them privacy in their need. When they'd eaten enough to take the edge off their hunger, he led them upstairs. The bedrooms were indeed empty, 4 of them, ranging from a large corner room to a smaller space that still had more square footage than the one room all 4 sisters had shared in their parents' cabin. "Take whichever you want," Caleb said. "There's linens in the closet at the end of the hall. Beds might need airing out. They haven't been used in a while." "Why do you have all these empty rooms?" Ruth asked with the directness of a 6-year-old. The other sisters tensed, but Caleb just looked down at her. "My wife and I, we hoped for a big family. It didn't work out that way." The past tense spoke volumes. "I'm sorry," Eliza said quietly. "So am I." Caleb cleared his throat. "Look, I know this is strange. I know you don't have any reason to trust me, but here's how this is going to work. This is your home now. You're not prisoners. You're not servants. If you want to help around the ranch, I'll appreciate it and teach you what you need to know. If you need time to just be, that's fine too. We'll figure out the details as we go." "What about school?" Margaret asked. "Catherine and Ruth should be in school." "There's a school in town. We'll register them." Caleb looked at Eliza and Margaret. "If you want to continue your education, we'll work something out." It was too much, too generous, too good to be true. Eliza waited for the catch, for the conditions, for the moment when the mask would slip and show what he really wanted. But Caleb just stood there, looking tired and sad and genuine. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said finally. "I've got evening chores to finish. Come down when you're ready, or don't. Whatever you need." He left, his boots heavy on the stairs. The sisters looked at each other in the hallway of this big empty house that was supposedly now their home. "Do we trust him?" Margaret whispered. "I don't know," Eliza admitted. "But what choice do we have?" "We could run," Catherine suggested. "To where?" Eliza shook her head. "We have no money, no family, nowhere to go. At least here we're together." "I like him," Ruth announced. "He has kind eyes." "He has sad eyes," Margaret corrected. "Can't they be both?" Ruth asked, with the wisdom of children who see things adults miss. That night, the sisters chose rooms, Ruth insisting on staying with Eliza, Catherine, and Margaret, taking rooms next to each other. They made up beds with linens that smelled of cedar and disuse. They washed in cold water from the pump. They stood at windows looking out over land that seemed to stretch forever. And downstairs, Caleb sat alone at his kitchen table, wondering what the hell he'd just done and whether he was equipped to undo even a fraction of the damage that had been inflicted on 4 young souls who'd lost everything. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise of change. The auction was over, but the real test, learning to trust, learning to heal, learning to become something resembling a family, that was just beginning. Dawn came too early and too bright, spilling through uncurtained windows with the indifference of light that doesn't care whether you're ready for a new day. Eliza woke to find Ruth curled against her like a comma, one small fist clutching the worn fabric of Eliza's nightdress. For a moment, suspended between sleep and consciousness, she forgot where they were. Then memory crashed back. The auction, the stranger, the ranch, the promise of safety that still felt too fragile to believe. She slipped out of bed carefully, trying not to wake her youngest sister, and moved to the window. The land stretched out in shades of gold and brown, pastures rolling toward distant hills that looked like they'd been painted with a careful brush. Cattle dotted the landscape, dark shapes against the pale grass. Near the barn, she could see a figure moving, Caleb, already at work though the sun had barely cleared the horizon. The house was silent around her. Strange how quickly you could notice the difference between the silence of being alone and the silence of having people nearby. This was the latter, a quieter kind of quiet, filled with the small sounds of other people breathing in other rooms. Eliza dressed in the same faded calico she'd worn yesterday. It was the only dress she owned besides the one currently hanging over the chair to air out. She braided her hair with practiced efficiency and went downstairs, moving carefully on treads that creaked underfoot. The kitchen surprised her again in daylight. It was larger than she'd realized, with a good stove, a sturdy table, cabinets that lined one wall. But there was a neglected quality to it, a sense that meals were prepared here but not enjoyed, that this space had forgotten what it meant to be the heart of a home. She found bread in the bread box, butter in the ice box, eggs in a basket on the counter. Without consciously deciding to, she began making breakfast. It felt safer to have her hands busy, to be doing something useful. If she was useful, maybe they could stay. She had bacon sizzling in the pan when Margaret appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair mussed from sleep, her eyes still heavy. "You're up early," Margaret said, her voice rough. "Couldn't sleep." Eliza cracked eggs into the pan. "Did I wake you?" "No, the quiet did." Margaret moved to the water pump, worked the handle until water gushed into the basin. She splashed her face, the shock of cold driving away the last cobwebs of sleep. "This is strange, isn't it? Being here." "Everything's strange now." "Do you think he meant what he said? About us not being servants?" Eliza turned the bacon carefully. "I think he meant it when he said it. Whether he'll still mean it a week from now, a month from now, that's different. The back door opened, bringing a gust of cool air and Caleb with it. He stopped when he saw them, surprise crossing his face. "You're awake." "We're used to early mornings," Eliza said, more defensive than she intended. "I wasn't criticizing." Caleb moved to the sink, scrubbed his hands with the harsh soap that sat on the ledge. "I'm just not used to people being in the house." "Should we have stayed upstairs?" Margaret asked. "No." Caleb dried his hands on a towel that had seen better days. "This is your home. You can be wherever you want." That word again. Home. It sat awkward in Eliza's mouth, too big to swallow, too heavy to hold. "I made breakfast," she said instead. "I hope that's all right." Caleb looked at the stove, at the bacon and eggs, at the bread she'd sliced and put on a plate. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite pain, not quite gratitude. Something more complicated than either. "You didn't have to do that." "I know. But we have to eat, and I know how to cook." "Then I'm grateful." He pulled out a chair, sat down heavily like a man who'd already put in half a day's work. "Coffee's in the canister there, if you know how to make it." Eliza did. Her mother had shown her how to make coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, the way her father liked it. She set about the familiar ritual, finding comfort in the routine. By the time Catherine came down, rubbing sleep from her eyes, breakfast was ready. Ruth appeared moments later, still clutching her rag doll, her golden curls a wild halo around her sleep-soft face. They sat at the table, the five of them, in a configuration that felt both natural and utterly foreign. Caleb at the head, the girls arranged along the sides, empty chairs marking absences that nobody mentioned. "This is good," Caleb said after the first bite. "Really good." Eliza waited for the rest. The expectation, the assumption that now she'd shown she could cook, it would become her job. But Caleb just kept eating, his focus on his plate, giving them space to do the same. Ruth kicked her feet under the table, not quite reaching the floor. "Do you have animals besides cows?" "Chickens," Caleb said. "Some pigs. 3 barn cats who think they run the place. A dog who's getting old but still tries to work." "Can I see them?" Ruth's eyes lit up with the first real enthusiasm Eliza had seen since their parents died. "After breakfast, I'll introduce you." Caleb's expression softened watching her. "Fair warning, the cats aren't friendly. They're working cats. Keep the mice down in the barn." "That's all right. I won't try to pet them." "Smart girl." They finished eating in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Eliza started to clear the plates, but Caleb stopped her with a raised hand. "Leave them. We'll figure out chores later, but not on your first morning." "We can't just sit idle," Margaret protested. "You won't be. But first, we need to talk about how this is going to work." Caleb pushed his chair back slightly. "I know you're used to working hard. Farm kids always are. I'm not going to take advantage of that. This ranch runs on routine. I have hands who come during busy seasons, but day to day, it's just been me. With 4 of you here, things change." "What do you want us to do?" Eliza asked directly. "I want you to settle in. Get used to being here. Catherine and Ruth need to start school. That's not negotiable. Education matters." He looked at the 2 younger girls. "There's a school in town. Decent teacher. You'll go 3 days a week to start. See how it goes." Catherine's face brightened. She'd always loved learning, had been the best reader in her class before everything fell apart. "What about us?" Margaret gestured to herself and Eliza. "That's up to you. If you want to continue school, we'll work it out. If you'd rather learn ranching, I can teach you. If you want to do something else entirely," he shrugged, "we'll figure that out too." "Just like that?" Eliza couldn't keep the skepticism from her voice. "No conditions?" Caleb met her eyes. "The condition is that you're safe and you stay together. Beyond that, I'm making this up as I go. I didn't plan to become a guardian to 4 girls. I just couldn't walk away from what was happening." "Why?" The question came from Margaret. "Why did you care? You didn't know us." For a long moment, Caleb didn't answer. He stared at his coffee cup, his jaw working like he was chewing words he wasn't sure he wanted to say. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I knew your father. Not well, but enough to respect him. Tom Moore was a good man who worked himself to the bone for his family. Seeing his daughters being sold like livestock, he stopped, shook his head. Some things you can't just walk past, even if getting involved complicates your life. It's more than complicated, Eliza said quietly. $2,000 is a fortune. Money's just money. It comes and goes. Caleb stood, moved to the window, looked out over his land. My wife and I, we saved for years thinking we'd need it for our children, for schooling, for dowries, for helping them get started in life. When she died, when they both died, that money just sat in the bank. No point to it anymore. He turned back to face them. Maybe this gives it a point. The raw honesty of it hit Eliza like a fist to the chest. This man who'd saved them was so clearly broken himself, and he was trying to piece them all together while still shattered. "I'm sorry," she said, inadequate words for the weight of his loss. "Me too." Caleb cleared his throat, visibly pulling himself back from whatever dark place he'd wandered into. "All right. Ruth, you wanted to see the animals. Catherine, you can come too if you like. Margaret, Eliza, I'll show you the ranch, explain how things work. Then you can decide what you want to learn." They spent the morning in a strange kind of orientation. Caleb showed them the barn, vast and organized with military precision. Each tool had its place, each space its purpose. The chickens lived in a well-built coop, the pigs in a pen that was mucked out regularly. The old dog, a border collie named Jack, regarded them with weary wisdom and decided they weren't worth the energy of suspicion. The barn cats, true to Caleb's warning, watched from the rafters with feral eyes and kept their distance. Caleb explained the daily routine, feeding schedules, milking times, egg collection. He showed them the vegetable garden, currently lying fallow for winter, but still showing signs of careful planning. He pointed out the smokehouse, the root cellar, the well that provided fresh water. "It's a lot," he acknowledged, seeing the overwhelmed expressions on their faces. "You don't need to learn it all at once. Take your time." "How do you manage all this alone?" Margaret asked, genuine curiosity breaking through her reserve. "Routine, systems, and accepting that some things won't get done perfectly." Caleb leaned against the fence rail, watching his cattle graze in the distance. "I keep the essential things running, animals fed, fences mended, basics maintained. Everything else waits for when I have time or when it becomes urgent." Eliza looked at the ranch with new eyes. It was well run, but showed the signs of a single man stretched thin, small repairs put off, opportunities for improvement ignored, the kind of maintenance that required extra hands simply left undone. "We can help," she said. "We want to help." Caleb studied her. "Because you want to, or because you think you have to? Does it matter?" "Yes." He said it simply, with conviction. "I don't want you working out of fear or obligation. If you help, it should be because you choose to, because you find something in it that matters to you." "That's not how the world works," Eliza said flatly. "People don't get to just do what they want. They do what they must to survive. Maybe, but you're not just surviving anymore. You're living. There's a difference." Before Eliza could respond, the sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. A buckboard came up the drive, driven by a woman Eliza didn't recognize, middle-aged, sturdy, with the capable look of someone who'd weathered her share of storms and come through intact. Caleb's expression shifted, surprise mixing with something that might have been wariness. "That's Martha Gaines, runs the general store in town with her husband." The wagon pulled up, and Martha climbed down with practiced ease. She was dressed practically in a serviceable brown dress, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, swept over the girls before landing on Caleb. "Caleb Whitmore, you've caused quite a stir in town," she announced without preamble. "News travels fast," Caleb said mildly. "News of a bachelor rancher buying 4 orphaned girls at auction for an astronomical sum? That's not news. That's a scandal waiting to be written." Martha's tone was tart, but her eyes weren't unkind. She turned to the girls. "I'm Martha Gaines. I knew your parents, not well, but enough to be sorry for your loss." "Thank you, ma'am," Eliza said carefully. Martha nodded, then turned her attention back to Caleb. "I brought supplies. Figured 4 girls might need more than what a bachelor keeps in his pantry." She gestured to the wagon bed, which was indeed loaded with crates and parcels. "You didn't have to do that," Caleb said. I know I didn't. I wanted to. Martha's expression softened slightly. Look, Caleb, I know you meant well yesterday. Everyone knows you meant well. But you've put yourself in a delicate position. A man alone with 4 girls, people are going to talk. Let them talk. It's not about you, it's about them. Martha gestured to the sisters. These girls have been through enough without being the subject of ugly gossip. They need protection, and not just from hunger and cold. Caleb's jaw tightened. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting you need a woman in this house. Someone who can chaperone, who can teach the girls things a man can't, who can shield them from the worst of the wagging tongues. I can't afford... I'm not talking about hiring someone. Martha cut him off. I'm talking about me. My youngest just got married and moved to Denver. My house is too quiet, and Frank spends most of his time at the store anyway. I could come out a few days a week, help get things settled, teach the girls what they need to know. Why would you do that? Eliza asked, suspicion coloring her tone. Martha looked at her directly. Because I'm a woman who's lived long enough to know the difference between gossip that's harmless and gossip that destroys. Because your mother, from what I knew of her, was a decent woman who deserved better than dying young and leaving her daughters at the mercy of a worthless brother-in-law. And because Caleb Whitmore, for all his rough edges, is one of the few truly good men I know, and I won't see him crucified for doing the right thing. The speech hung in the air, blunt and honest. Caleb shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. I appreciate the offer, he said slowly, but I need to think about it. Fair enough, think fast. Martha moved to the wagon, started unloading crates with the efficiency of someone who didn't wait for help. In the meantime, I brought flour, sugar, salt, fabric for dresses. Those girls can't wear the same rags every day. Thread, needles, and a few other necessities. Margaret and Eliza moved to help without being asked, their instincts for useful work too ingrained to ignore. Catherine and Ruth hung back, watching this new development with wide eyes. There's also books, Martha continued, pulling out a crate that clinked with the sound of glass jars. Primers for the young ones, some novels for the older girls. Can't have children in a house without books. Mrs. Gaines, Caleb started. Martha. And don't thank me. Just think about my offer. These girls need more than you can give them alone. And there's no shame in accepting help. She finished unloading, dusted her hands on her skirt. I'll be back Wednesday. By then, you'll have had time to think. She climbed back into the wagon, gathered the reins with competent hands. Girls, I know this is all strange and frightening, but Caleb's a good man. Give him a chance. Give yourself a chance. With that, she snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, heading back down the drive. They stood watching until the wagon disappeared, then turned to look at the supplies she'd left. More than they could have bought with a month's careful saving, given freely by a woman who owed them nothing. Why did she really come? Margaret asked quietly. Caleb sighed, ran a hand through his hair. Because she's right. I didn't think this through yesterday. I just acted. And now we're all dealing with the consequences. You regret it, Eliza said flatly. No. Caleb's response was immediate and firm. I don't regret stopping that auction. I don't regret keeping you together. But I do regret not thinking about how this looks, what it means for your reputations. Our reputations were destroyed the moment our uncle put us on that platform, Eliza said bitterly. Then we'll rebuild them. Caleb met her eyes. But Martha's right. You need more than I can provide. If she's willing to help, we'd be fools to refuse. They carried the supplies inside, stacking crates in the kitchen and parlor. The fabric Martha had brought was simple but new, calico and muslin in practical colors, enough to make dresses for all 4 girls. The books ranged from children's primers to more advanced texts, even a novel or two that made Margaret's eyes light up with hunger. That afternoon, while Catherine and Ruth explored the ranch under Jack's watchful supervision, Eliza and Margaret sat at the kitchen table with the fabric, trying to remember their mother's instructions about pattern making and seams. Caleb worked outside, the sound of his hammer ringing as he repaired a fence rail that had needed attention for months. Every so often, Eliza found herself looking out of the window, watching him work with the steady focus of a man who found comfort in physical labor. He's lonely, Margaret observed, following her sister's gaze. We're all lonely, Eliza replied. That's not what I mean. He's lonely in a different way, like he's forgotten how to be around people. Maybe we all have. That evening, Caleb taught them how to milk the cow, a patient old Jersey who tolerated their fumbling attempts with stoic resignation. Ruth proved surprisingly adept, her small hands finding the rhythm quickly, her delight at the first streams of milk making even Caleb smile. They ate dinner together again, this time a stew Caleb had made that was hearty but bland, speaking to a man who cooked for fuel rather than pleasure. Afterward, Margaret read aloud from one of the books Martha had brought, her voice filling the quiet house with words about adventures in places none of them had ever seen. Caleb sat in his chair by the cold fireplace, listening without comment, his face unreadable. Ruth fell asleep curled against Eliza, thumb in her mouth despite being too old for such comfort. Catherine fought to keep her eyes open, not wanting to miss a word. When Margaret finally closed the book, her voice hoarse from reading, Caleb stirred. Your mother taught you to read well. She loved books, Margaret said softly. She said reading was the cheapest way to travel the world. She was a wise woman. She was. Margaret stood carefully so as not to wake Ruth. I should get them to bed. I'll carry her, Caleb offered, moving to lift Ruth with surprising gentleness. The little girl stirred but didn't wake, simply transferring her trust from one protector to another in the fluid way of children. Eliza watched him carry her youngest sister upstairs, watched the careful way he navigated the stairs and laid Ruth on the bed, watched him step back like he was afraid his presence alone might cause harm. Thank you, Eliza said from the doorway. Caleb looked up, surprised. For what? For yesterday, for today, for not making this harder than it has to be. It shouldn't be hard at all. You're children who lost their parents. Basic decency says you deserve safety and care. Basic decency is rarer than you think. I know. Caleb moved past her into the hallway. But that doesn't make it any less right. He went back downstairs, leaving Eliza to help her sisters prepare for bed. They washed in cold water, changed into nightdresses Martha had included in her supplies, simple cotton that was nonetheless better than the worn linens they'd been wearing. They said quiet goodnights, each retreating to their chosen rooms. But sleep didn't come easily. Eliza lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house settling, of wind moving through trees she couldn't see, of cattle lowing in distant pastures. Strange how you could be physically exhausted but mentally unable to rest, your mind circling the same questions over and over. Who was Caleb Whitmore really? What did he want? How long before the kindness wore thin and the reality set in? Downstairs, Caleb sat at his kitchen table with a bottle of whiskey he rarely touched and a ledger he needed to update. The numbers told a clear story. The ranch was profitable, but $2,000 was still $2,000. It would take careful management to absorb that loss without cutting into necessary operations. But he'd meant what he said. Money was just money. He could always make more. What he couldn't do was walk away from 4 girls being sold like livestock and still look at himself in the mirror. He thought about Sarah, about the children they'd never had, about the empty rooms upstairs that had haunted him for 2 years. Those rooms had people in them now, frightened, damaged, wary people who had no reason to trust anyone, let alone him. He'd bought them their freedom, but freedom wasn't the same as safety. Safety wasn't the same as belonging. And belonging, that was going to take time he wasn't sure any of them had. The ledger sat forgotten as Caleb poured 2 fingers of whiskey, then poured it back into the bottle without drinking. He couldn't afford to be anything less than clear-headed. Not now, not with 4 lives depending on him to be better than he felt. Morning came again as it always did, indifferent to whether anyone was ready. This time all 4 girls were awake when Caleb came in from early chores. This time, breakfast was already cooking. Eliza had started it, but Margaret and even Catherine had helped, the 3 of them moving around the kitchen with the practiced coordination of sisters who'd worked together before. You're making a habit of this, Caleb observed. We're making ourselves useful, Eliza corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Useful means we have value. It means you have a reason to keep us. Caleb set down the eggs he'd collected, faced her directly. I don't need a reason to keep you. The papers are signed. You're not going anywhere unless you choose to. Everything has conditions, Eliza said stubbornly. even kindness. Then here's my condition. Stop waiting for me to turn into a monster. Stop bracing for the blow. If I'm going to hurt you, I'd have done it already." The bluntness of it caught her off guard. Margaret stopped stirring the porridge. Catherine froze with a plate halfway to the table. "I know you've been hurt," Caleb continued, his voice gentler. "I know you've learned not to trust, but you can't live your whole life in a crouch, waiting for the next bad thing. At some point, you have to try believing that maybe, just maybe, not everyone is out to harm you. And if we're wrong," Eliza's voice came out smaller than she intended, "then you'll deal with it when it happens. But don't punish me for crimes I haven't committed." It was fair, painfully, honestly fair. Eliza nodded slowly, feeling something tight in her chest loosen just slightly. They ate breakfast in a silence that felt different from before. Not comfortable yet, but moving in that direction. Afterward, Caleb announced his decision. "I'm accepting Martha's offer. She can come out 3 days a week, teach you things I can't, help with the house. The rest of the time we'll manage as we have been." "You don't have to do that," Margaret said. "I know, but it's the right thing to do." Caleb stood, collected his hat from the peg by the door. "Today, I need to ride out and check the north fence line. It's about a 4-hour round trip. You'll be alone here." The implications hung in the air. He was trusting them not to run, not to destroy anything, not to prove his faith misplaced. "We'll be fine," Eliza said. "I know you will." Caleb paused at the door. "There's a rifle above the mantel if you need it. God forbid. Food in the pantry. If anyone comes by, you don't have to answer the door. This is your home. Act like it." He left, and they heard him ride out moments later, the sound of hoofbeats fading into distance. The 4 sisters stood in the kitchen of a house that was supposedly theirs, in a life that still felt borrowed, trying to figure out what came next. "We should clean," Catherine suggested. "Really clean. Make it nice." And so they did. They swept and scrubbed, dusted, and organized, bringing order to a space that had forgotten what a woman's touch could do. They found linens that needed mending and sat together stitching, their hands remembering skills their mother had taught. They explored the house more thoroughly, finding traces of the woman who'd lived here before. A pressed flower in a Bible, delicate handwriting in a recipe book, a shawl forgotten in a closet that still carried the faint scent of lavender. Sarah Whitmore had existed in these walls, had loved and hoped and lost. Her absence was a palpable thing, a ghost they were now living alongside. When Caleb returned that afternoon, he stopped in the doorway of the kitchen and just stared. The room gleamed. Curtains they'd found in a trunk now hung at the windows. The table was set with dishes they'd washed and polished. Bread was rising in bowls covered with clean cloths. "You didn't have to do this," he said, his voice rough. "We wanted to," Eliza replied, and realized it was true. They hadn't cleaned out of obligation or fear. They'd cleaned because it felt good to make something better, to take a space that was hurting and help it heal. Maybe that's what they were all doing, not just the house, but each other, taking broken pieces and seeing if they could fit them back together into something that resembled whole. It wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be quick. But standing there in that clean kitchen with the smell of rising bread and the last light of afternoon streaming through newly washed windows, it almost felt possible. Wednesday arrived with Martha Gaines, punctual as sunrise and twice as inevitable. She pulled up in her buckboard precisely at 9 o'clock, the wagon bed loaded with what looked like half the contents of her house. Caleb met her in the yard, and Eliza watched from the kitchen window as they spoke in low tones, Martha gesturing emphatically while Caleb listened with the patience of a man who knew arguing with Martha Gaines was about as productive as arguing with weather. When they came inside, Martha surveyed the transformed kitchen with an approving eye. "Well, someone's been busy." "The girls wanted to help," Caleb said. "Did they now?" Martha's sharp gaze swept over the 4 sisters standing in an uncertain cluster near the table. Or did they think they had to prove their worth? The accuracy of the observation stung. Eliza lifted her chin. "Does it matter which?" "Matters a great deal, child. Work done from joy sits different than work done from fear." Martha set down the basket she'd been carrying. "But we'll get to that. First things first, Caleb, you've got fence work waiting, and I've got teaching to do. Go on." Caleb looked like he wanted to protest, then thought better of it. I'll be in the north pasture if you need me." "We won't," Martha said with the kind of certainty that brooked no argument. After Caleb left, Martha turned her full attention to the girls. "All right, let's establish some ground rules. I'm not here to replace your mother. Nobody could do that. I'm not here to boss you around or make you miserable. I'm here because a house with 4 young women and 1 man needs a woman's presence, and because you deserve to learn things that will help you make your own way in this world." "What kind of things?" Catherine asked quietly. "Practical things. How to sew properly, not just mend. How to cook meals that don't just fill bellies but satisfy souls. How to manage a household budget, keep accounts, make decisions about money. How to carry yourselves so people see your strength instead of your circumstances." Martha pulled out a chair and sat. "But first, we need to talk about what happened in town." The sisters exchanged glances. Eliza spoke first. "We know people are talking. Talking is putting it mildly. Half the town thinks Caleb's a saint. The other half thinks he's either a fool or has less noble intentions." Martha's expression hardened. "The second half is wrong, and I'll thrash anyone who suggests otherwise. But that doesn't stop the whispers." "We didn't ask to be rescued," Margaret said, defensive. "No, you didn't, but you were, and now we all deal with the consequences." Martha leaned forward. "Here's the truth. Women get judged more harshly than men, and young women without family get judged harshest of all. Fair? No. Reality? Yes. Which means you need to be smarter, work harder, and give people less ammunition to use against you." "How?" Eliza asked. "By being beyond reproach. By learning everything you can. By making yourselves indispensable not just to this household, but to this community." Martha pulled fabric from her basket. "Starting with making you dresses that don't look like you've been sleeping in ditches. Can any of you use a sewing machine?" Margaret raised her hand tentatively. "Mother taught me basic stitching." "Good. There's a machine upstairs, Sarah's. She was an excellent seamstress, and I won't see that machine gathering dust." Martha stood. "Come on, time's wasting, and we've got 4 dresses to make before winter sets in proper." The sewing machine sat in what had clearly been Sarah Whitmore's workroom, a small space off the main bedroom with good light from 2 windows. Dust covered everything like a shroud, and there was something almost sacred about disturbing it, like they were intruding on a shrine to a woman they'd never meet. Martha had no such compunctions. She threw open windows, stripped dust covers from furniture, and set about organizing fabric and notions with ruthless efficiency. Sarah would hate seeing this room unused. She believed idle hands were a sin, and unused skills were a tragedy. "You knew her well?" Ruth asked, watching Martha work with fascinated attention. "Well enough. She was younger than me, but we served on the church ladies' auxiliary together. Good woman. Kind, but not soft, if you understand the difference." Martha threaded the sewing machine with practiced hands. "When she died, it about killed Caleb, too. Man loved her something fierce." "What happened?" Catherine's curiosity overcame her usual reticence. Martha's hands stilled for just a moment. "Childbirth. Baby came early, complications set in. Neither of them made it through the night." She resumed her work, but her voice had gone softer. "Caleb was never quite the same after. Closed himself off, threw himself into work, stopped coming to town except when necessary. This is the first time in 2 years he's let anyone into this house besides me, bringing the occasional casserole." The weight of that settled over them. Caleb hadn't just saved them from the auction. He'd opened a home he'd sealed shut in grief, had let strangers into a space that still held the ghost of his greatest loss. "That's why you're helping," Eliza said slowly. "Not just because of gossip, because you think we're good for him." "Smart girl." Martha's smile was approving. "I think you need each other. He needs a reason to remember what it means to be alive instead of just surviving. You need someone who'll fight for you without expecting payment. Seems to me that's a fair trade." They spent the rest of the morning cutting fabric and learning the intricacies of the sewing machine. Martha proved to be a patient but exacting teacher, insisting they do things right rather than fast, pulling out seams that weren't straight and making them try again. By lunch, they'd made progress on 2 simple dresses for the younger girls. "Not bad," Martha declared, examining Catherine's work. "You've got a good eye for straight lines. Margaret, Your tension's too tight. You'll pucker the fabric. Eliza, stop rushing. Quality takes time. They ate lunch around the kitchen table, bread and cheese and the preserves Martha had brought. While they ate, Martha questioned them about their education, their skills, their plans for the future. It felt like an interrogation wrapped in conversation, but not unkindly so. Catherine, you're bright. Too bright to be wasted. You'll go to school Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Ruth too, though she's young yet. Martha turned to the older girls. You two are old enough you could be done with formal schooling, but that doesn't mean you should be. What do you want to learn? Margaret answered first. I want to keep reading. Mother always said education was the one thing nobody could take from you. Your mother was right. What about you, Eliza? Eliza hesitated. She'd spent so much time focused on survival, on keeping her sisters safe, that she'd forgotten she was allowed to want things for herself. I want to understand numbers, accounting, budgets, business. I want to know how to manage things so we're never at someone else's mercy again. Practical and smart, Martha nodded approvingly. I can teach you bookkeeping. Frank keeps complaining I'm better with the store accounts than he is anyway. It'll give me an excuse to pass more of it off. You'd do that? Eliza couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Why wouldn't I? I'm not doing this out of charity, girl. I'm investing in your future. The more capable you are, the more options you have. Options mean freedom. Martha stood, began clearing plates. Now, afternoon lesson. Cooking that doesn't taste like punishment. Caleb's a decent man, but he cooks like someone who's forgotten food should be pleasurable. The cooking lesson transformed the kitchen into organized chaos. Martha directed them through making a proper roast with vegetables, teaching them how to season meat, how to time everything so it finished together, how to make gravy that wasn't lumpy. Ruth proved surprisingly useful as a taster, her honest reactions guiding their adjustments. More salt, she'd declare, or that's too bitter, with the confidence of a 6-year-old whose opinions were being taken seriously. Caleb returned late in the afternoon to find the kitchen filled with warmth and good smells, 4 girls working under Martha's direction with flour on their faces and something like contentment in their eyes. He stopped in the doorway, and Eliza saw the flash of pain cross his face before he mastered it. This must be what he'd imagined his home would look like, before loss taught him that imagination and reality rarely aligned. Don't just stand there, Martha called. Wash up. Dinner's almost ready, and you'll sit down like civilized people and eat it. They gathered around the table, 5 of them plus Martha making 6, and for the first time since their parents died, the girls experienced something that felt almost like normal. The food was good, the conversation careful, but real. The silence between words comfortable instead of strained. Martha left as the sun touched the horizon, promising to return Friday. And Thursday, she added, looking at Catherine and Ruth, you're coming to town with Caleb. Time to get you registered for school. After she left, Caleb helped with dishes, an offer that surprised Eliza until she realized he'd probably been doing his own washing up for 2 years and saw no reason to stop now. They worked in quiet efficiency, the rhythm of wash and dry and put away almost meditative. Martha means well, Caleb said finally, breaking the silence. But she can be overwhelming. If it's too much, it's not, Eliza interrupted. She's teaching us things we need to know. Maybe. But don't let her make you think you have to be perfect to deserve to be here. Aren't we supposed to be beyond reproach? Eliza echoed Martha's words. Caleb's jaw tightened. Martha sees the world as it is. I'd rather work toward changing it. One person can't change the world. No, but they can change their corner of it. Thursday dawned gray and threatening rain. Caleb hitched the wagon while Catherine and Ruth dressed in their best clothes, which still weren't much, but at least they were clean. The younger girls were nervous, their breakfast sitting uneaten as they worried about school, about other children, about being the girls everyone would know had been sold at auction. They'll stare, Catherine said quietly. Everyone will know who we are. Let them stare, Eliza said, braiding her sister's hair with firm hands. You're not ashamed of what happened. You survived it. That's nothing to hide. Easy to say. I know. Eliza met her sister's eyes in the small mirror propped on the dresser. But it's still true. The ride to town was quiet, tension radiating from the two younger girls despite Caleb's attempts at easy conversation. Millbrook looked different in daylight filtered through clouds. Smaller somehow, less threatening but no more welcoming. People watched as they passed, some waving to Caleb, others simply staring at the girls in the wagon bed. The school was a simple white building at the edge of town, a bell tower rising from its peaked roof. Children played in the yard, their shouts and laughter carrying that particular quality of youth that doesn't yet know to be self-conscious. The teacher, Miss Sarah Hendricks, met them at the door. She was younger than Eliza expected, mid-20s perhaps, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and a gentle smile that seemed genuine rather than practiced. "Mr. Whitmore," she greeted, "and you must be Catherine and Ruth Moore." "Yes, ma'am," Catherine whispered. Miss Hendricks crouched to Ruth's level. "I knew your mother, just slightly. She came to town occasionally for books. She loved reading, didn't she?" Ruth nodded, surprised into responding. "She read to us every night." "Then I think you'll like my classroom. We read every day, too." Miss Hendricks straightened, addressed Caleb. "I heard what happened at the auction. I heard what you did. That took courage." "Common decency shouldn't require courage," Caleb said gruffly. "Perhaps not. But we live in a world where it does." Miss Hendricks turned back to the girls. "You're welcome here. Both of you. If anyone gives you trouble, you tell me immediately." Catherine and Ruth exchanged glances, some of the tension leaving their small shoulders. Miss Hendricks walked them into the schoolhouse, introducing them to other students with a matter-of-fact kindness that left no room for cruelty. Caleb and Eliza waited in the wagon, watching through the windows as the girls took seats at wooden desks worn smooth by generations of students. Margaret had stayed home to continue sewing lessons with Martha, leaving Eliza alone with Caleb for the first time since the auction. "They'll be all right," Caleb said, as much to himself as to her. "Will they?" Eliza kept her eyes on the schoolhouse. "Or will this just be another place they learn that being orphans makes them less than everyone else? Miss Hendricks is good people. She won't allow that." "One teacher can't control what children say when adults aren't listening," Caleb sighed. "You're determined to expect the worst, aren't you?" "I'm determined to be realistic." "There's a difference between realistic and pessimistic, Eliza. One keeps you safe, the other keeps you miserable." Before she could respond, he flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward. They had supplies to collect, and Martha had given Eliza a list of items needed for the sewing projects. The general store loomed ahead, and with it, the first real test of how the town would receive them. Frank Gaines was behind the counter when they entered, a thin man with kind eyes and the patient air of someone who'd spent his life listening to other people's problems. He greeted Caleb warmly, then turned his attention to Eliza with curiosity rather than judgment. "You must be one of the Moore girls. I'm Frank Gaines, Martha's husband." "Eliza Moore, sir." "No sir necessary. Frank's fine." He took the list she offered, scanning it quickly. "Martha's got you sewing, I see. She's a good teacher, strict but fair." While Frank gathered supplies, other customers filtered in and out. Some nodded politely. Others whispered behind their hands, casting sidelong glances at Eliza and Caleb. One woman, Mrs. Turnbull, wife of the man who'd bid on Eliza at the auction, looked her up and down with open disdain before turning her back entirely. Eliza felt her face heat with shame and anger mixed together until she couldn't separate them. She started to say something, to defend herself against an accusation that hadn't even been spoken aloud, but Caleb's hand on her shoulder stopped her. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't give them the satisfaction." "She thinks I know what she thinks. She's wrong. You know she's wrong. That's enough." But it wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough as long as people looked at her and saw scandal instead of a girl who'd lost everything and was just trying to survive. It wouldn't be enough as long as kindness was interpreted as something twisted, as long as her very existence in Caleb's house was treated as evidence of impropriety. They collected their supplies in tense silence and returned to the wagon. The ride back to the ranch felt longer than the ride in. Every mile weighted with unspoken frustrations and the growing realization that yesterday's rescue had created today's complications. "I'm sorry," Caleb said finally. "For what?" "For not thinking about how this would affect you. All of you. I was so focused on stopping the auction that I didn't consider what came after." "Would you have done anything differently?" Eliza asked. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. No, I couldn't have walked away, but I should have been smarter about it. Martha says we need to be beyond reproach. Martha's not wrong, but that doesn't make it fair. They arrived back at the ranch to find Margaret and Martha in the sewing room, surrounded by fabric and making visible progress on what would become proper dresses. Martha took one look at Eliza's face and knew something had happened. What occurred? She demanded. Nothing, Eliza said. That's not what your expression says. Caleb? He recounted the incident at the store with economical words. Martha's face darkened with each sentence. That woman, she said when he finished, has the moral authority of a snake. Her husband tried to buy you like livestock, and she has the audacity to judge. Martha stood, brushing fabric scraps from her skirt. I'll have words with her. Please don't, Eliza said quickly. It'll just make things worse. Worse than being treated like a scarlet woman for the crime of surviving? Martha's voice was sharp. No, child. Some things require confrontation. Martha, Caleb started. Don't Martha me, Caleb Whitmore. These girls are under your protection, which means they're under mine too. I won't stand by and watch busybodies tear them apart because they're too small-minded to recognize decency when they see it. The fierceness of her defense cracked something in Eliza's chest. She'd been defending herself and her sisters for so long that having someone else step into that role felt foreign and overwhelming. Thank you, she whispered. Martha's expression softened. You don't thank people for doing what's right. You just remember it when it's your turn to stand up for someone else. The afternoon passed in the rhythm of sewing and instruction, Martha's voice filling the house with lessons both practical and philosophical. She taught them stitches and seam allowances, but also spoke about dignity, about building lives that meant something, about the difference between surviving and thriving. When they broke for dinner, Caleb announced his plan. Tomorrow I'm riding to the county seat. There's a lawyer there, I trust. I want to make the guardianship arrangement ironclad. No loopholes. No way for Vernon to come back and try to reclaim you for any reason. He signed papers, Margaret said. He did. But I want more than his signature. I want legal documentation that couldn't be challenged even if he sobered up and got religion. Caleb looked at each girl in turn. I want you protected, not just now but permanently. That costs money, Eliza said. Everything costs money. The question is whether it's worth it. And this is? Without question. Saturday morning, Caleb left before dawn. The ride to the county seat a full day's journey. He'd be gone overnight, staying at a boarding house, and returning Sunday afternoon. It was the first time the girls would be truly alone at the ranch, without even the buffer of Martha's presence. You'll be fine, he said before mounting. There's food in the pantry, rifle above the mantel if needed. Jack will alert you if anyone approaches. Lock the doors at night. I'll be back tomorrow. They watched him ride out, 4 sisters standing in the yard of a house that still didn't quite feel like home, about to spend 24 hours responsible for themselves and each other. We should make a list, Catherine said, ever practical. Figure out what needs doing. They spent the day in productive activity, feeding animals, collecting eggs, cleaning, mending, cooking. Margaret read aloud while they worked, her voice providing continuity between tasks. Ruth helped where she could and played with Jack when she couldn't, the old dog tolerating her attention with patient grace. As evening approached, they gathered in the kitchen to prepare dinner. Eliza found herself relaxing into the routine, into the comfort of having her sisters around her, safe and together. Maybe they could make this work. Maybe Caleb's protection and Martha's teaching would be enough to build something resembling a future. The sound of approaching horses shattered that fragile peace. Jack's bark, sharp and warning, brought them all to attention. Eliza moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see. 3 riders approached, men she didn't recognize, moving with the casual confidence of people who expected no resistance. Who are they? Margaret whispered. I don't know. Eliza's mind raced. Caleb had said to lock the doors, that Jack would alert them to visitors. He hadn't said what to do if those visitors didn't look friendly. The men dismounted in the yard. The one in front was older, heavy-set, with the weathered face of someone who worked outdoors. The other 2 were younger, harder, with guns visible on their hips. A knock came at the door, loud and demanding. We know you're in there, a voice called. Open up. We want to talk to Whitmore. He's not here, Eliza called back, trying to keep her voice steady. Then we'll talk to you. The doorknob rattled. Open the door. No. Eliza looked at her sisters. Catherine had gone pale. Margaret stood frozen. Ruth clutched her rag doll with white knuckles. Catherine, take Ruth upstairs. Margaret, get the rifle. You know how to use that? The man outside called, amusement in his voice. Eliza didn't answer. Margaret returned moments later with the rifle, her hand shaking as she held it. Eliza took it, checked that it was loaded, Caleb kept it ready just in case, and positioned herself near the door where she could see through the window but had cover if needed. What do you want? She called out. Just to talk. About a debt Whitmore owes. Caleb doesn't owe anyone anything. That's not what we heard. Seems he bought something that wasn't his to buy. Some folks think that creates an obligation. Understanding crashed over Eliza like cold water. Vernon. These men were connected to Vernon Hayes somehow, to the debts he owed, to the money he'd promised people before spending it all on drink and cards. The auction was legal, Eliza said. Sheriff Coleman was there. Papers were signed. Legal and right aren't always the same thing. The man's voice hardened. Open the door and let's discuss this reasonable-like. I'm not opening this door. You're trespassing. Leave before I shoot. Laughter from the other men. Girl thinks she's dangerous. I grew up on a farm, Eliza called out, voice steadier now. I've shot coyotes, wolves, and one rabid dog. I won't hesitate to add trespassing criminals to that list. The laughter stopped. A long silence followed, tense and dangerous. Whitmore's gone for the night? The lead man finally asked. Eliza didn't answer, wouldn't give them that information. Fine. We'll be back. Tell him Jackson Reeves came calling. Tell him we need to discuss his purchase and the complications it created. The sound of boots on wooden steps. You girls sleep tight now. They mounted and rode off, but not far. Eliza could hear them settling in somewhere beyond the barn, making camp. They weren't leaving. They were waiting. The sisters gathered in the kitchen, Ruth crying quietly, Catherine trying to be brave, Margaret shaking with delayed fear. We need to get help, Margaret said. How? Eliza set the rifle on the table, her own hands trembling now that the immediate threat had passed. Caleb's gone. The nearest neighbor is miles away. We can't leave the younger girls alone, and we can't all go together in the dark with those men out there. We wait for Caleb, Catherine said. He won't be back until tomorrow afternoon at the earliest. Can we hold out that long? They had food, water, the rifle. The house was solid. Doors and windows could be secured. But they were 4 girls alone facing at least 3 armed men who clearly had no intention of leaving peacefully. Eliza made the decision. We fortify. Check every door, every window, make sure they're locked tight. We take shifts keeping watch through the night. If they try to break in, we shoot first and ask questions later. Can you actually shoot someone? Margaret asked quietly. Eliza thought about the auction, about Vernon's cruelty, about these men who thought 4 orphaned girls were easy prey. To protect you 3? Without hesitation. They spent the next hour securing the house, testing locks, checking sight lines from windows. Eliza positioned the rifle where she could reach it quickly from multiple rooms. They brought water upstairs, along with bread and cheese, in case they needed to stay there for an extended period. Night fell with the men still camped beyond the barn. They'd built a fire, small but visible, a reminder of their presence. Jack paced restlessly, growling low in his throat at intervals. The sisters tried to maintain normalcy. They ate dinner though none of them were hungry. Margaret read aloud though her voice kept catching. Ruth fell asleep from exhaustion, thumb in her mouth, rag doll clutched tight. Eliza took the first watch, sitting by the downstairs window with the rifle across her lap. Margaret stayed with her, too frightened to sleep. I hate this, Margaret whispered. I hate being scared all the time. I hate that we can't just be safe. I know. Do you think Caleb knew this might happen? I think Caleb knew there'd be complications. I don't think he anticipated this specifically. What if they come back with more men? What if we can't hold them off? Then we do what we've always done, Eliza said quietly. We survive. We protect each other. We refuse to break. Hours passed in tense silence. The men's fire burned low but didn't go out. Around midnight, one of them approached the house again, circling it slowly, testing windows. Eliza tracked his movement, rifle ready, heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. He tried the back door. The lock held. He rattled it harder. "I can shoot through this door," Eliza called out. "Test me if you want." The rattling stopped. Footsteps retreated. But Eliza knew they'd be back. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially when they thought they had the upper hand. Catherine took the next watch while Eliza tried to rest. Sleep was impossible, but lying down at least gave her body a chance to recover from the adrenaline. Margaret stayed awake, keeping Catherine company, the two of them whispering in the dark about anything except their current situation. Dawn came gray and cold. The men were still there, still waiting. Eliza checked the rifle again, counted ammunition, tried to calculate how long they could hold out if this turned into a siege. The answer wasn't encouraging. Mid-morning, the sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching fast. Eliza's heart sank. Reinforcements. The men had called for help, but the approaching rider wore a badge that caught the weak sunlight. Sheriff Coleman, riding hard, with two deputies flanking him. The relief was so intense Eliza thought she might collapse. She ran to unlock the door, nearly stumbling in her haste. Coleman dismounted before his horse fully stopped, his face grim. "Are you girls all right?" he demanded. "We're fine. They didn't get in, but they've been out there all night." "I know. Frank Gaines sent his boy to fetch me yesterday evening. Said he heard Reeves talking at the saloon about paying Whitmore a visit while he was out of town." Coleman's expression hardened. "Where are they?" Eliza pointed toward the barn. Coleman and his deputies moved in that direction, hands on their weapons. Within minutes, angry voices carried across the yard. Coleman's authoritative bark, Reeves's defensive protests. The sisters watched from the window as the three men were rounded up, disarmed, and escorted away from the property. Reeves shouted something about debts and obligations, but Coleman shut him down with words Eliza couldn't quite hear, but whose tone was unmistakable. When the sheriff returned to the house, his expression had shifted from grim to angry. "Those men won't be bothering you again. Reeves is going to spend a few days in jail thinking about the consequences of trespassing and threatening minors. The other two will be fined and warned." "Thank you," Eliza managed. "Don't thank me yet. This isn't over." Coleman removed his hat, ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Vernon Hayes sold his guardianship rights, but the men he owed money to think that sale should have benefited them. They're not going to let this go easily." "What can we do?" "Nothing you're not already doing. Caleb's at the county seat getting the legal paperwork sorted, which is smart. When he gets back, we'll have a talk about security, about precautions." Coleman looked at the four of them, exhausted, frightened, but unbroken. "You did good. Holding them off took courage." "We didn't have a choice," Eliza said. "There's always a choice. You could have opened that door, could have let fear make you vulnerable. You didn't. That matters." After Coleman left, the sisters collapsed into chairs around the kitchen table. The crisis had passed, but its echoes would linger. They'd been tested and had survived, but the test itself revealed how precarious their safety really was. Margaret started to cry. Not the frightened tears of last night, but the exhausted sobs of someone who'd held themselves together through terror and could finally fall apart. Catherine joined her, and then Ruth, and finally even Eliza, the four of them weeping together over losses both past and present, over fear and relief, and the overwhelming weight of everything they'd endured. When Caleb rode in late that afternoon, he found them red-eyed but resolute, the house still locked tight, Jack pacing protectively in the yard. He took one look at their faces and knew something had happened. "Tell me," he said simply. Eliza told him, all of it. The men, the threats, the long night, Coleman's intervention. Caleb's expression grew darker with each sentence, his jaw working like he was grinding words between his teeth. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, walked to the window, looked out over land that was supposed to be safe. "This is my fault," he said finally. "I underestimated how far Vernon's debts reached. I thought paying him would end it." "You couldn't have known," Margaret said. "I should have." Caleb turned back to face them. "I should have anticipated this. Should have made arrangements. Should have what?" Eliza interrupted. "Let us be sold separately. Walked away because it might be complicated." "You saved us, Caleb, The rest is just dealing with consequences. Consequences that put you in danger. We've been in danger since our parents died. At least now we're in danger together, in a house with locked doors and a man who gives a damn what happens to us. The bluntness of it seemed to shake something loose in Caleb. He nodded slowly. All right, then we adapt. I'll talk to Coleman about hiring a ranch hand who can be here when I can't. I'll teach you girls to shoot properly, not just threaten. We'll make this place as secure as we can. Did you get the legal papers done? Catherine asked. Caleb's expression shifted, something like satisfaction crossing his face. I did. Ironclad guardianship, witnessed and notarized. Vernon Hayes has no legal claim to any of you anymore. Even if he sobered up and tried to challenge it, he'd lose. It was one piece of security in a situation that felt increasingly precarious. But it was something. That evening, they sat around the table and made plans. Real plans, practical plans. The kind of strategic thinking that came from accepting reality and working within it rather than wishing it were different. Caleb would hire help. The girls would learn defense. They'd establish protocols for when he had to leave. They'd turn the ranch from a place of refuge into a fortress, if that's what survival required. And through it all, what kept circling back was the simple truth that had brought them together in the first place. They were stronger together than apart. Caleb alone couldn't have kept them safe. The girls alone would have been overwhelmed. But together, combining his resources with their determination, they stood a chance. It wasn't the future any of them had imagined, but it was the future they had, and they'd fight to protect it with everything they possessed. The Monday after the standoff brought changes that rippled through every corner of their lives. Caleb hired Thomas Webb, a quiet man in his 50s who'd worked ranches across 3 states and asked no questions about why a bachelor suddenly needed help protecting 4 girls. Thomas moved into the bunkhouse that had sat empty since Caleb's hired hands left after Sarah's death, and his presence shifted the ranch's atmosphere from vulnerable to vigilant. But the real transformation began 3 weeks later, when Sheriff Coleman rode out with news that pulled the ground out from under their fragile stability. The sisters were in the sewing room with Martha, working on winter coats, when they heard Coleman's voice downstairs. Something in his tone, formal, careful, made Eliza set down her needle and move to the doorway. Margaret followed, leaving Catherine and Ruth under Martha's watchful eye. Caleb and Coleman stood in the parlor, their voices low but urgent. Eliza caught fragments. County seat, legal challenge, 30 days, before Caleb noticed them, and his expression shifted into something carefully blank. Girls, he said, come in. You need to hear this. Coleman looked uncomfortable, his hat turning in his hands. I'm sorry to bring bad news, but there's been a development. Vernon Hayes has filed a petition with the territorial court challenging the guardianship transfer. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Eliza felt Margaret's hand find hers, gripping tight enough to hurt. On what grounds? Caleb's voice was dangerously quiet. Claims he was coerced, that the sale happened under duress, that he's since reformed and wants to reclaim his familial rights. Coleman's expression made clear what he thought of these claims. It's nonsense, but it's legal nonsense. The territorial judge has agreed to hear the case. When? Eliza heard herself ask. Hearing set for 4 weeks from today. You'll need to appear, all of you. The judge will want to hear testimony about the auction, the transfer, the current living situation. And if he rules in Vernon's favor? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. Coleman exchanged a look with Caleb before answering. Then the guardianship reverts to Hayes and the court orders you return to his custody. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the normal sounds of the house seemed to hold their breath. That's not going to happen, Caleb said finally, each word carved from granite. I'll get lawyers. The best lawyers money can buy. We'll fight this. Fighting costs money, Coleman warned. And Vernon's got backing now. Turns out the men he owed found a lawyer who sees profit in this case. They're representing him pro bono, hoping to get a settlement out of you to make it all go away. I won't pay them a cent. Caleb's hands had curled into fists at his sides. This is extortion dressed up as legal process. Maybe so. But it's still legal process, and we have to respect that. Coleman settled his hat back on his head. I'll testify on your behalf, as will Frank and Martha. Miss Hendricks has already sent word she'll speak to the girl's character and progress in school, but ultimately, it'll come down to what the judge believes serves the children's best interests. After Coleman left, the house fell into a stunned quiet. Martha came down from the sewing room, having heard everything through the floorboards, and set about making coffee with the grim determination of someone who dealt with crisis through action. Catherine and Ruth appeared in the doorway, their faces tight with the kind of fear that came from understanding just enough to know their world was crumbling again. "Are we going back to Uncle Vernon?" Ruth asked in a small voice. "No," Caleb said immediately, crouching to her level. "I promise you, that's not going to happen." "You can't promise that," Eliza said, hating the words even as she spoke them. "You can fight, you can hire lawyers, but you can't guarantee what a judge will decide." Caleb stood, met her eyes. "Then we make our case so compelling he has no choice." "How?" Margaret demanded. "Vernon will lie. He'll say whatever he needs to say to win, and we're just children. Who listens to children?" "This judge will," Martha said firmly, setting coffee cups on the table with decisive clinks. "Judge Morrison's been on the bench for 20 years. He's fair, not easily swayed by pretty speeches. If you girls stand up there and tell the truth about what Vernon did, about what your life is like now versus what it would be with him, Morrison will hear you." "And if that's not enough?" Catherine's voice trembled. "Then we find another way," Caleb said. "We appeal. We fight in a different court. We take this all the way to the territorial Supreme Court if we have to." "That could take years," Eliza said quietly, "and cost a fortune." "I don't care." Caleb's voice carried absolute conviction. "I made you a promise that you'd stay together, that you'd be safe. I don't break my promises." The next 4 weeks became a masterclass in controlled panic. Caleb hired a lawyer from Denver, a sharp woman named Elizabeth Crawford, who'd made her reputation defending the defenseless and had no patience for legal maneuvering, masquerading as justice. She arrived on a Tuesday, all business in a severe black suit, and spent 3 hours interviewing each girl separately, taking notes in quick, precise handwriting. "Your uncle's lawyer will try to paint Caleb as having improper motives," she told them bluntly. "They'll insinuate things, ask leading questions designed to make you doubt yourselves. You need to be prepared for that." "What kind of things?" Margaret asked. Crawford's expression didn't soften. "They'll ask if Caleb has ever been inappropriate with any of you, if he's made you uncomfortable, if there's been any physical contact that seemed wrong. They'll try to twist normal household interactions into something sinister." Eliza felt rage bubble up in her chest. "That's disgusting. Caleb's never, he wouldn't, I know that, you know that, but the law requires we address these questions directly." Crawford leaned forward. "Which is why your answers need to be clear, consistent, and absolutely truthful. Don't embellish, don't get defensive, just state facts. Can you do that?" They could. They would. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Martha increased her visits, coming 4 days a week now instead of 3, her presence serving as both chaperone and character witness. She drilled the girls on their testimony, playing devil's advocate with questions so harsh that Eliza sometimes wanted to cry. "Why should we believe you prefer living with a stranger over your own blood?" Martha would demand, channeling the opposing lawyer. "Because blood doesn't make someone family," Catherine would answer, her voice growing stronger with each practice session. "Caleb treats us with respect. He keeps us safe. He lets us stay together. Uncle Vernon sold us like animals. But he's reformed now. He says he's stopped drinking, found steady work, wants to make amends. Then he should make amends by leaving us alone." This from Ruth, whose innocent face delivering such pointed truth proved devastatingly effective. The school became another battleground. Word of the legal challenge spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and suddenly Catherine and Ruth found themselves the subject of renewed scrutiny. Some parents pulled their children aside, warning them to stay away from those auction girls. Others made pointed comments about the inappropriateness of the living arrangement. Miss Hendricks shut down the worst of it with sharp efficiency, but she couldn't stop the whispers on the playground or the way some children edged away like misfortune might be contagious. Catherine came home one afternoon with tear-stained cheeks and skinned knees from being pushed during recess. Ruth's rag doll had been stolen and torn apart, left in pieces on her desk like a threat. Caleb found them crying in their room and made a decision that probably cost him sleep, but earned the girls' fierce loyalty. The next morning, he rode to school with them, walked them into the building, and stood in front of the assembled children with the kind of quiet authority that made even the bullies pay attention. "My name is Caleb Whitmore," he said. "Catherine and Ruth Moore live with me. They're under my protection. If anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me directly. If anyone hurts them, mocks them, or makes their lives difficult, they'll answer to me. Is that understood?" Dead silence, broken only by Miss Hendrick's quiet, "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." After that, the overt bullying stopped. The whispers continued, but the physical intimidation ceased. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. At home, life developed a strange duality. On the surface, routines continued: chores, lessons, meals, evenings spent reading or sewing, or simply sitting together. But underneath ran a current of anxiety that colored everything: the knowledge that in 3 weeks, 2 weeks, 1 week, their entire future would be decided by a judge who didn't know them and had no particular reason to care. Eliza threw herself into learning everything she could about household management, about ranching, about being useful. If she could prove their value, maybe that would matter. If she could show that they weren't burdens but contributors, maybe that would tip the scales. Martha found her one evening scrubbing floors that didn't need scrubbing, working with the desperate energy of someone trying to outrun her thoughts. "Stop," Martha said gently, taking the brush from Eliza's hands. "This won't help. I need to do something. You need to breathe. You need to trust that the truth will be enough." "What if it's not?" Eliza's voice cracked. "What if we tell the truth and it doesn't matter? What if the law decides Vernon's rights as a blood relative outweigh everything else?" Martha sat down on the floor beside her, heedless of her good dress. "Then we find another way. We appeal. We fight. We don't give up. Everyone keeps saying that, but nobody can guarantee it'll work." "No," Martha agreed. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, but I can tell you this. I've watched you girls transform this house from a mausoleum into a home. I've watched Caleb remember what it means to live instead of just exist. I've seen Ruth blossom in school, Catherine's confidence grow, Margaret's grief start to heal. That's not nothing, Eliza. That's everything. It might not be enough for a judge. Then we make damn sure it is." The night before the hearing, none of them slept well. Eliza lay awake, listening to the house settle, to Ruth's quiet breathing beside her, to the distant sound of Caleb pacing downstairs. At some point past midnight, she gave up on sleep and went down to find him sitting at the kitchen table with the guardianship papers spread out like he could will them to be stronger through sheer force of concentration. "You should rest," she said from the doorway. He looked up, unsurprised by her presence. "So should you." "Can't." She moved to sit across from him. "My mind won't stop." "Mine either." Caleb rubbed his eyes, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently. If I'd been smarter about the transfer, gotten better documentation, anticipated the legal challenges." "You saved us," Eliza interrupted. "Everything else is just details. Details that might cost you your future." "No." She reached across the table, covering his hand with hers, a gesture so unlike her usual reserve that it made him look up in surprise. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you gave us something Vernon never could. You gave us hope. You showed us that not all adults are cruel or selfish. You proved that sometimes people do the right thing even when it's hard. That might not be enough. It's enough for me." She pulled her hand back, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm 17, Caleb. In less than a year, I'll be 18 and legally able to make my own decisions. If the worst happens, if Vernon somehow wins, I'll run. I'll take my sisters and we'll disappear before we let him touch us." "Don't talk like that." "Why not? It's the truth. I'd rather be a fugitive than let that man have any power over us again." Caleb's expression shifted into something pained and proud at the same time. "You're fierce. All 4 of you. Whatever happens tomorrow, remember that. You're not victims. You're survivors." "I don't feel like a survivor. I feel scared." "Being scared doesn't make you weak. It makes you human." They sat in companionable silence until the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows. Then they rose together and began preparing for a day that would determine everything. The territorial courthouse in the county seat was an imposing stone building designed to intimidate those who entered seeking justice. The courtroom itself had high ceilings, dark wood, and an atmosphere heavy with the weight of decisions made and lives altered. Judge Morrison presided from an elevated bench, a white-haired man with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Vernon Hayes sat with his lawyers at one table, looking markedly different from the slovenly drunk who'd sold his nieces on an auction platform. Someone had cleaned him up, new suit, fresh haircut, sober expression carefully maintained. He looked almost respectable, which made Eliza's stomach turn. Their side of the courtroom felt both stronger and more vulnerable. Caleb sat with Elizabeth Crawford, his face carved from stone. The four sisters occupied seats directly behind them, Martha on one side and Sheriff Coleman on the other, a visible wall of support. The hearing began with opening statements. Vernon's lawyer, a slick man named Porter, who smiled too much, painted a picture of a troubled soul who'd made mistakes but had since reformed. He spoke of blood ties, family bonds, second chances. He described Vernon's current employment at a mill, his sober living, his deep regret for his past actions. Mr. Hayes made errors in judgment during a difficult time, Porter said smoothly, but he's family. These girls belong with their blood relative, not with a stranger, however well-intentioned. Elizabeth Crawford's opening was shorter and sharper. This case isn't about second chances. It's about what serves the best interests of four children who've already lost everything. The question before this court is simple. Who provides safety, stability, and the opportunity for these girls to thrive? The evidence will show conclusively that Caleb Whitmore has done more for these children in 3 months than Vernon Hayes did in his entire period of guardianship. The testimony began with procedural witnesses, Sheriff Coleman describing the auction, the legal transfer, the authenticity of the documents. Frank Gaines spoke to Vernon's debts, his drinking, his reputation. Miss Hendricks testified about Catherine and Ruth's progress in school, their integration into the classroom, their visible improvement in health and demeanor since living with Caleb. Then came Vernon Hayes himself. He took the stand with downcast eyes and a repentant manner that might have been convincing if Eliza hadn't known better. Porter led him through a carefully constructed narrative of grief, poor choices, and redemption. "I was devastated by my brother's death," Vernon said, his voice catching just slightly. "I turned to drink to cope. I made terrible decisions. But I've been sober for 2 months now. I've found honest work. I've rented a proper house. I'm ready to provide a home for my nieces." "Why do you want guardianship restored?" Porter asked. "Because they're family. Because I owe it to my brother to care for his daughters. Because I want to make amends for my failures." Crawford's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Hayes, you testified you've been sober for 2 months. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "And the auction occurred 3 months ago?" "Yes." "So you were still drinking when you decided to sell your nieces?" "I wasn't selling them. I was finding them appropriate homes. By putting them on a platform and accepting bids from strangers," Vernon's carefully maintained composure slipped. "It was legal. The sheriff said it was legal." "Legal doesn't mean moral, Mr. Hayes. Did you investigate the people bidding on your nieces? Did you ensure they'd stay together? Did you care at all what happened to them after they left that platform?" "I cared. You cared enough to take $2,000 and spend it on settling gambling debts before the ink was dry on the transfer papers. Is that correct?" "I had obligations. Obligations to card sharps and saloon owners, but not to 4 orphaned children." Crawford let that hang in the air. "Mr. Hayes, in the 3 months since the transfer, how many times have you attempted to visit your nieces?" Vernon hesitated. "I wanted to give them time to adjust." "0 times. How many letters have you sent?" "I'm not much for writing." 0 letters. "How many inquiries have you made about their well-being, their education, their health?" The silence was damning. "No further questions," Crawford said, disgust evident in her tone. The afternoon brought the testimony everyone had been dreading, the girls themselves. Catherine went first, her small frame almost swallowed by the witness chair. Porter tried to be gentle, but his questions had sharp edges designed to cut. "Catherine, Mr. Whitmore is a stranger to you, isn't he?" "He was. He's not anymore." "But you barely know him. Don't you think you'd be more comfortable with family?" Uncle Vernon isn't comfortable. He's mean when he drinks, and he drinks all the time. Caleb is kind. But living with an unmarried man without a woman in the house, doesn't that seem inappropriate? Martha comes 4 days a week, and Caleb's never been inappropriate. He treats us with respect. Porter pressed harder, trying to shake her, but Catherine held firm, her answers clear and consistent. When Crawford questioned her, she asked simply, "Where do you want to live, Catherine?" "With Caleb. With my sisters. Together." Margaret followed, then Ruth, each telling their truth with increasing confidence. Ruth's testimony proved particularly powerful. Her innocent honesty made Porter's insinuating questions seem even more sordid by contrast. Finally, Eliza took the stand. She'd been dreading this moment, but when it came, she found herself surprisingly calm. She looked at Vernon and saw not a threat but a pathetic man trying to profit off children he'd never cared about. Porter's questions came fast and pointed. "Miss Moore, isn't it true that you cook, clean, and perform household labor for Mr. Whitmore?" "I help with the household because I live there. We all contribute." "So you are working for him, providing services in exchange for room and board?" "No, I'm living in a home where everyone contributes to the collective good. There's a difference." "Is there? Or has Mr. Whitmore simply found a more palatable way to exploit your labor?" Crawford objected, but Eliza answered anyway. "Caleb Whitmore paid $2,000 to keep us together and safe. He's hired help to protect us. He's fighting a legal battle he didn't ask for because he won't break his promise to us. If you think that's exploitation, you don't understand the meaning of the word." Porter's expression hardened. "Miss Moore, you're 17, almost an adult. Don't you find it concerning that you're living in a house with an unmarried man?" "I find it concerning that you're trying to twist kindness into something dirty. Caleb has been nothing but respectful. He gave us our own rooms, our own space, our own choices. He's never once made any of us uncomfortable or crossed any line. The only person who should be ashamed in this courtroom is my uncle, who sold us like livestock and now wants us back because he sees profit in it." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison banged his gavel. "Order." Porter tried to recover. "Your uncle has reformed for 2 months. 2 months of sobriety doesn't erase years of cruelty and neglect. It doesn't prove anything except that he can pretend to be decent when money's on the line." "Miss Moore, I'm not finished." Eliza leaned forward, every word deliberate. "You want to know what serves our best interests? Being together. Being safe. Having someone who actually cares whether we live or die. Caleb Whitmore gave us that. Vernon Hayes never did and never will." When she left the witness stand, her legs were shaking, but her head was high. She'd said everything she needed to say, and the truth of it hung in the air like smoke. Crawford and Porter gave their closing arguments, Porter emphasizing blood ties and family redemption, Crawford hammering home the evidence of Vernon's neglect and Caleb's proven commitment. Then it was done, and Judge Morrison announced he'd render his decision within the week. The wait was excruciating. They returned to the ranch and tried to resume normal life, but every sound made them jump. Every approaching rider might be bringing news. Martha stayed at the ranch full time, her presence both comfort and acknowledgement that they were in crisis mode. 5 days later, Sheriff Coleman rode out with an envelope bearing the court seal. They gathered in the parlor, the 5 of them plus Martha and Thomas, and Caleb opened it with hands that trembled slightly. He read in silence, his expression unreadable. Then he looked up at the girls, and his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "We won," he said simply. The relief was so overwhelming that Eliza actually swayed on her feet. Margaret burst into tears. Catherine and Ruth grabbed each other, laughing and crying at once. Martha let out a breath she'd apparently been holding for days. Morrison ruled that Vernon's petition was without merit, Caleb continued, reading from the decision. He found that the original transfer was legal and binding, executed without coercion or duress. He noted Vernon's failure to show any genuine interest in the girl's welfare and his obvious motivation by financial gain rather than familial concern. He further stated that uprooting the girls from a stable, nurturing environment to return them to someone with a documented history of neglect would be contrary to their best interests. "It's over?" Catherine asked in a small voice. "It's over," Caleb confirmed. "The guardianship is permanent and irrevocable. Vernon can't challenge it again." They should have celebrated, should have been purely joyful, but the emotion that flooded through Eliza was more complex than simple relief. They'd won, yes, but they'd had to fight for something that should have been automatic: the right to safety, to staying together, to being treated as human beings rather than property. That night, Caleb built a fire in the parlor, the first time he'd done so since Sarah's death. They gathered around it, the warmth and light pushing back the autumn darkness. Margaret read aloud, not from a novel, but from a book of poetry their mother had loved. Ruth fell asleep against Eliza, finally relaxed enough to surrender to exhaustion. Catherine leaned against Martha, who stroked her hair with gentle hands. And Caleb sat in his chair, watching them with an expression Eliza was learning to recognize. Grief and gratitude mixed together, the look of a man who'd lost everything and somehow found something worth protecting again. "Thank you," Eliza said quietly, the words inadequate but sincere. "For what?" "For fighting, for not giving up, for proving that sometimes the right thing wins." Caleb's smile was slight but genuine. "We fought together, and we'll keep fighting, whatever comes next." Whatever came next. The phrase held both promise and uncertainty, but for the first time since their parents died, uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like possibility, like the beginning of something rather than the end. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise of seasons turning. Inside, the fire crackled, and 5 people who'd found each other through tragedy sat together in the warm glow. No longer just survivors, but something more. A family, chosen and fought for, fragile but real. Winter arrived in earnest 2 weeks after the court ruling, transforming the Kansas landscape into something stark and beautiful. Snow fell in the kind of heavy silence that made the world feel smaller, more intimate, wrapping the ranch in white that softened harsh edges and muffled sound. Inside the house, life settled into rhythms that felt less like survival and more like actual living. But victory in court, Eliza was learning, didn't erase the scars that came before it. It just gave you the safety to finally acknowledge they existed. She noticed it first in Ruth, who'd seemed the most resilient. The 6-year-old began having nightmares 3 weeks after the hearing, waking the house with screams about being sold again, about men coming to take them away. Eliza would hold her through the trembling aftermath, singing songs their mother had sung, but the fear had taken root and wouldn't be easily uprooted. Catherine grew quieter, more withdrawn, her confidence in the classroom eroding as she internalized the whispers that hadn't completely stopped. She came home one afternoon and asked Eliza, voice small and ashamed, "Are we bad people? Is that why everyone treats us different?" Margaret threw herself into books with an intensity that looked like escape, reading until her eyes burned and her head ached, using stories to avoid confronting the reality that they'd been hours away from being separated forever. And Eliza herself found that winning hadn't brought peace, just a different kind of worry. Every time Caleb left the ranch, she felt panic flutter in her chest. Every approaching rider made her reach for the rifle. Every letter or official-looking document that arrived made her stomach drop, certain it would be another challenge, another fight, another person trying to tear apart what they'd built. Martha noticed. Of course Martha noticed. She found Eliza one gray December afternoon scrubbing the same counter she'd already cleaned twice, working with the manic energy of someone trying to outrun their thoughts. "Stop," Martha said, taking the cloth from her hands with gentle firmness. "I'm not finished." "Yes, you are. Come sit." They sat at the kitchen table, and Martha poured coffee with the kind of deliberate care that said this conversation mattered. Outside, snow fell past the window in lazy swirls. Somewhere upstairs, Margaret was reading to Ruth. The house held that particular quiet of winter afternoons when time seemed to move slower. "You're wearing yourself out," Martha said. "I've watched you these past weeks. You barely sleep. You work constantly. You jump at shadows. I'm fine." "You're not. And that's all right, Eliza. You don't have to be fine all the time." Something in Eliza's chest cracked at that, the permission to not be strong threatening to undo her completely. "If I stop being fine, everything falls apart." "That's not true. You've got Caleb, me, your sisters. We're all holding this together. You don't have to carry it alone." "Someone has to." "Why?" Martha's question was gentle but insistent. "Why does it have to be you?" Because I'm the oldest. Because they depend on me. Because if I don't, Eliza's voice broke. If I don't keep us safe, who will? Caleb, me, Sheriff Coleman, Miss Hendricks, a whole community of people who've proven they'll stand with you. Martha reached across the table, covered Eliza's hand with her own. You're not alone anymore, child. You haven't been since Caleb stood up at that auction, but you're still acting like you are. The truth of it hit Eliza like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on protecting her sisters that she hadn't noticed she'd stopped protecting herself, hadn't let herself grieve, hadn't let herself feel the full weight of everything they'd lost and barely survived. I don't know how to stop, she whispered. Start small. Let someone else make dinner tonight. Let Margaret help with the mending. Trust that if you rest, the world won't end. Martha squeezed her hand. You're 17 years old, Eliza. You've been carrying adult burdens since your parents died. It's time to let some of that weight go. That evening, when Caleb came in from checking the cattle, he found the kitchen empty and dinner unmade. For a moment, concern flashed across his face, until he heard voices from the parlor. He followed the sound to find all 4 girls sitting with Martha, no one working, just talking. Eliza sat curled in a chair with her knees pulled up, looking younger than she had in months, while Martha told a story about her own childhood that had the girls laughing. Everything all right? Caleb asked from the doorway. Everything's fine, Martha said. We're taking the evening off. You can make dinner for once. Caleb's expression shifted through surprise to understanding to something softer. All right then, hope you like beans and bacon, because that's about the extent of my repertoire. Sounds perfect, Eliza said, and meant it. The new year arrived with bitter cold and a letter that changed everything in ways none of them anticipated. It came addressed to Caleb, but concerned all of them, written in careful script by Elizabeth Crawford, the lawyer who'd won their case. Caleb read it at breakfast, his expression growing thoughtful. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at the 4 girls arrayed around the table. Crawford's been approached by a group of reformers in the territorial legislature, he said. They want to use our case as evidence for changing the laws around orphaned children. They're proposing legislation that would end the practice of auctioning children and establish a formal foster care system with oversight and standards. Silence greeted this announcement as the girls processed what it meant. They want us to testify? Margaret asked finally. They want permission to use our court records, testimony from the hearing, documentation of what happened. They'd like us to appear before a legislative committee if we're willing, but it's not required. Would it help? Catherine's voice was small but determined. Crawford thinks it could make the difference between the bill passing or dying in committee. Personal testimony is powerful, but Caleb leaned forward, his expression serious. It would mean reliving everything publicly. It would mean more scrutiny, more questions, more people knowing your story. Eliza felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but this time it felt different. Not a burden she had to carry alone, but a choice she could make with her sisters. Can we talk about it? She asked. Just us? Of course. They gathered in the sewing room, the 4 of them, sitting among half-finished projects and winter light filtering through clean windows. For a long moment, nobody spoke. I want to do it, Catherine said finally, her voice stronger than expected. I want other children not to have to go through what we did. It'll be hard, Margaret warned, standing up in front of strangers, telling them about the worst day of our lives. It was hard the first time, Ruth said, wise beyond her 6 years. But we did it. We can do it again. They all turned to Eliza, waiting for her opinion, her decision. But this time she realized it wasn't just her decision to make. What do you want, truly? She asked each of them. Not what you think I want, or what you think you should want. What do you actually want? Catherine spoke first. I want to help. I want to stand up and say what happened was wrong, and make sure it doesn't happen to someone else. Margaret nodded slowly. I want our story to mean something beyond just us. I want something good to come from all the bad. Ruth clutched her rag doll, a new one, carefully sewn by Martha to replace the one destroyed by bullies. I want to be brave like Eliza was brave. You're already brave, Eliza told her. Then she took a breath, feeling the weight of her sister's trust and the possibility of something larger than their individual survival. Then we do it. We testify. We use what happened to us to protect other children. When they told Caleb, his expression mixed pride with concern. You're sure? I won't push you into this. We're sure, Eliza said, and this time she spoke for all of them with confidence born from actual consensus rather than assumed authority. The legislative hearing was scheduled for late February, giving them 2 months to prepare. Crawford came to the ranch multiple times, coaching them on testimony, explaining the political landscape, helping them understand how their personal tragedy could become the foundation for systemic change. The opposition will argue that auctioning orphans is a time-honored tradition, she explained during one session, that it ensures children are placed in homes where they can work and earn their keep. They'll paint it as practical and economical. It's barbaric, Margaret said flatly. I agree. But we need to prove it systematically. We need to show the harm it causes, the lack of oversight, the potential for abuse. Your testimony provides the human face to the legal argument. As winter deepened and preparation intensified, something unexpected happened. The girls began to heal in ways that went beyond physical safety. Talking about what had happened, examining it from different angles, framing it as evidence rather than just trauma, it gave them a way to process the experience that felt productive rather than simply painful. Catherine started speaking up more in school, her confidence growing as she prepared to speak before legislators. Margaret began writing her thoughts down, crafting testimony that was both personal and powerful. Ruth practiced her answers with the kind of serious determination that made even Caleb smile. And Eliza found herself letting go of some of the hypervigilance that had defined her existence since the auction. But progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when the weight of everything threatened to crush them again. It happened on a gray January afternoon when a stranger rode up to the ranch. He was well-dressed, official-looking, and the sight of him triggered every alarm bell in Eliza's system. She grabbed the rifle before Caleb could stop her, her hands shaking as she trained it on the approaching rider. Eliza, wait! Caleb moved toward her carefully, like approaching a spooked horse. He could be from Vernon, could be another lawyer, he could be a lot of things, but shooting him before we know seems extreme. Caleb's voice was gentle but firm. Give me the rifle. No. Her grip tightened. I'm not letting anyone hurt us again. Eliza. Caleb moved to stand beside her rather than between her and the stranger. Look at me. She did, dragging her eyes from the approaching rider to meet Caleb's steady gaze. We're safe, he said quietly. The guardianship is permanent. Vernon has no legal standing. Whatever this man wants, we'll handle it together. But you don't need to shoot first and ask questions later. What if I'm wrong? What if letting my guard down means you're healing? It means you're learning to trust that safety isn't just an illusion. He held out his hand. Give me the rifle, please. It took everything she had to release her grip, to let him take the weapon, to stand there feeling exposed and vulnerable as the stranger dismounted. He turned out to be a census taker, documenting households for territorial records. Completely harmless. But the incident left Eliza shaken, forcing her to confront how deeply fear had embedded itself in her bones. That night, Caleb found her sitting on the porch, despite the cold, wrapped in a quilt and staring at nothing. Mind if I join you? He asked. She shook her head, and he sat beside her, the boards creaking under his weight. I thought I was getting better, she said finally. I thought winning in court meant we could move on. Healing isn't a straight line. Some days you're fine. Some days you're right back at that auction platform. Caleb's voice carried the weight of his own experience with grief and trauma. But the fact that you're having bad days doesn't mean you're not making progress. How do you know? Because 6 months ago, you would have shot that census taker and asked questions later. Today, you gave me the rifle. That's progress. Eliza pulled the quilt tighter. I'm tired of being scared. I know. Caleb was quiet for a moment. After Sarah died, I was scared of everything. Scared to stay in the house with all its memories. Scared to leave in case I forgot what she looked like. Scared to hope for anything because hope had betrayed me so completely. It took me 2 years to start climbing out of that fear. What changed? You and your sisters, seeing what real courage looked like, standing on that platform facing the worst and refusing to break. It shamed me out of my cowardice. We're not courageous. We're just surviving. I know. But survival in the face of everything stacked against you? That's the purest form of courage there is. They sat in companionable silence until the cold drove them inside, where Margaret had made hot chocolate and Ruth was teaching Catherine a hand-clapping game their mother had taught her. Normal moments, precious because they'd been so hard won. February arrived with the kind of cold that made breath visible and turned the world brittle. They traveled to the territorial capital in a hired coach, Caleb and the 4 girls plus Martha as chaperone and Crawford as guide. The journey took 2 days, and the capital city overwhelmed them with its size and noise and the sheer number of people pressed together. The legislative building was imposing, marble and brass and the weight of power concentrated in ornate rooms. The committee room where they'd testify was smaller than the courtroom but somehow more intimidating, with legislators arranged in a semicircle like judges rendering verdict on their worth. Crawford had warned them the opposition would be present, and she was right. Several well-dressed men sat on the opposition side, their expressions ranging from skeptical to openly hostile. Among them, Eliza was stunned to see Silas Turnbull, the man who'd bid on her at the auction, who'd wanted to buy her for $50 and work her until she broke. The sight of him made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. She wasn't that terrified girl on the platform anymore. She had a voice now, and she was going to use it. The hearing opened with dry testimony from legal experts and social reformers, establishing the framework of the proposed legislation. Then Crawford called her first witness. "I'd like to call Catherine Moore to testify about her experience with the current system." Catherine walked to the witness chair with her head high, wearing one of the dresses Martha had taught them to make, looking young and vulnerable and utterly determined. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and then proceeded to demolish the opposition's arguments with simple, devastating honesty. "What was it like standing on that auction platform?" Crawford asked. "Like being an animal at a livestock sale?" Catherine said clearly. "People looking at us, deciding if we were worth buying, discussing our value like we couldn't hear them." "Did anyone ask what you wanted?" "No, ma'am. Nobody cared what we wanted. We were just problems to be solved." The opposition lawyer, a pompous man named Harrison, tried to shake her on cross-examination, but Catherine held firm. "Isn't it true that the auction ensured you'd be placed in homes?" he asked. "It ensured we'd be separated and sold to whoever bid highest. That's not the same as being placed in homes." "But surely some of the bidders were good people. Mr. Turnbull bid on my sister Eliza. He runs his boarding house workers 16 hours a day and pays them in room and board instead of wages. Is that what you call a good home?" Turnbull's face flushed red from the gallery. Harrison pressed harder. "The current system has worked for decades. The current system treats children like property," Catherine interrupted, her voice rising. "It worked for the people buying us, maybe. It didn't work for us." Margaret testified next, speaking to the psychological harm of being commodified, of knowing adults saw you as labor rather than a human being. Ruth's testimony was brief but powerful, her 6-year-old innocence making the cruelty of the system impossible to ignore. Then it was Eliza's turn. She walked to the witness chair, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Crawford's questions started gently, establishing the facts of their parents' death, Vernon's guardianship, the auction itself. "Tell the committee what it felt like when the bidding started," Crawford said. Eliza took a breath, reaching for the truth beneath the trauma. "It felt like being erased, like everything that made me a person, my thoughts, my feelings, my hopes. None of it mattered. I was just a body that could work, a problem to be solved with money. When men bid on me, they weren't thinking about who I was or what I might become. They were calculating how much labor they could extract before I broke." "And how did Mr. Whitmore's intervention change that?" "He saw us as human beings. He bid to keep us together, not to separate us. He spent a fortune to give us safety and dignity. He fought for us in court. He's still fighting for us now." Eliza looked directly at the legislators. "The current system would have split my family apart and put us with people who saw us as investments. The proposed system would prevent that. Which one sounds more just to you?" Harrison's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to paint Caleb as having improper motives, trying to suggest the girls were ungrateful or manipulated. But Eliza had been preparing for this, and she met every insinuation with calm refutation. "Are you aware that some people question the propriety of your living arrangement?" Harrison asked. I'm aware that some people have dirty minds and see impropriety where none exist, Eliza shot back. Caleb Whitmore has been nothing but respectful. He gave us our own rooms, our own space, our own choices. The only people who should be questioned are the ones who think kindness must have ulterior motives. But surely you can see how it appears. I see a man who sacrificed his comfort and his money to save 4 strangers. I see a community that supported us. I see a system that almost destroyed us and people like you trying to defend it. Eliza leaned forward. The question isn't how our situation appears. The question is why you're more concerned with appearances than with the fact that children are being sold like livestock in this territory. The room erupted in murmurs. The committee chairman banged his gavel for order. Harrison sat down, looking flustered. Crawford's redirect was simple. Miss Moore, if this legislation passes, what difference will it make? It'll mean other children won't have to stand on auction platforms wondering if they'll be separated from their siblings. It'll mean oversight and standards instead of treating orphans as convenient labor. It'll mean the law protects children instead of enabling their exploitation. Eliza looked at each legislator in turn. We survived the current system, but we shouldn't have had to. No child should have to. You have the power to change that. The question is whether you'll use it. The hearing concluded with closing arguments. Harrison defended tradition and practicality. Crawford spoke of justice and human dignity. Then the committee retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. They sat in an anteroom, the 4 girls and Caleb and Martha, saying little because there was nothing left to say. They'd done everything they could. The rest was up to legislators they didn't know making decisions for reasons they couldn't control. 2 hours later, the committee chairman emerged. His expression was carefully neutral as he invited them back into the chamber. The vote had been close, 7-5 in favor of the proposed legislation. It would move to the full territorial legislature with the committee's recommendation for passage. Your testimony, the chairman said, looking at the girls, made the difference. Personal stories cut through political rhetoric. Thank you for your courage in coming forward. They left the Capitol the next morning, the coach rattling over frozen roads toward home. The girls were subdued, processing what they'd done and what it might mean. Did we really make a difference? Ruth asked. We did, Caleb confirmed. The committee vote means the bill has momentum. It'll still need to pass the full legislature, but you gave it the best chance possible. And if it doesn't pass? Margaret asked quietly. Then we tried. We stood up and spoke truth. That matters regardless of the outcome. But 6 weeks later, a telegram arrived with news that made the whole ranch erupt in celebration. The territorial legislature had passed the Foster Care Protection Act by a margin of 32-18. Children could no longer be auctioned. A formal system of oversight would be established. Standards for placement would be enforced. It wouldn't undo what had happened to them, but it would prevent it from happening to others. That night, they celebrated with a dinner that Martha and the girls prepared together. A feast that filled the house with warmth and good smells, and the kind of joy that comes from knowing you've made the world slightly better. Thomas joined them, and Miss Hendricks and Sheriff Coleman and Frank and Martha Gaines. The table barely fit everyone, and the noise level was chaotic, and it was perfect. After dinner, after the guests had left and the younger girls had gone to bed, Eliza found herself alone with Caleb in the parlor. The fire crackled low, casting dancing shadows on walls that had once felt like a mausoleum, but now felt like home. Thank you, she said quietly. Caleb looked up from the book he'd been reading. For what? For everything. For saving us. For fighting for us. For giving us the safety to become people who could stand in front of legislators and demand change. You were always those people. You just needed the opportunity to show it. Maybe. Eliza moved to sit in the chair across from him. But I've been thinking about that day at the auction, about what would have happened if you hadn't shown up. Don't, Caleb said quietly. Don't torture yourself with what-ifs. I'm not torturing myself. I'm grateful. We all are. You changed our lives in ways I'm still trying to understand. You changed mine too. Caleb set down his book. This house was a tomb before you came. I was just existing, going through motions, waiting for time to pass. You reminded me what it means to live. We're a mess, Eliza said with a slight smile. Ruth has nightmares. Catherine still struggles with confidence. Margaret uses books to avoid feelings, and I jump at shadows. You're human. You've been through trauma. Healing takes time. You sound like Martha. Martha's usually right. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that only comes from people who've been through fire together and emerged on the other side. What happens now? Eliza asked finally. We won in court. We changed the law. What comes next? Living, Caleb said simply. School for the younger girls. Learning ranch work if you want it. Growing up, making choices, building futures. He paused. Being a family, however imperfect and unconventional that looks. Is that what we are? A family? What else would you call it? Eliza thought about that. About 4 orphaned girls and a widowed rancher. About Martha's fierce protectiveness and Thomas's quiet presence. About a community that had rallied around them despite gossip and judgment. It didn't look like the family she'd lost, but maybe family didn't have to look any particular way. I'd call it home, she said finally. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it transformed the landscape with the kind of dramatic change that made winter feel like a distant memory. Green pushed through brown, flowers erupted in unexpected places, and the ranch came alive with the promise of new beginnings. Catherine excelled in school, her academic achievements earning praise from Miss Hendricks and grudging respect from classmates who'd once mocked her. Ruth made friends, her natural charm winning over children whose parents had warned them away. Margaret discovered a talent for writing, her essays about their experiences moving people to tears and action. And Eliza, slowly and with setbacks, learned to let go of some of the responsibilities she'd carried for so long. She learned to sleep through the night without checking on her sisters. She learned to let Caleb leave the ranch without panic. She learned to trust that safety wasn't an illusion that would shatter at the first sign of trouble. She also learned ranching, working alongside Caleb and Thomas to understand the rhythms of cattle and land, discovering that she had a head for business and a talent for management that would serve her well in whatever future she chose. One warm May afternoon, she rode out to the north pasture where Caleb was inspecting new fence posts. He looked up as she approached, shading his eyes against the sun. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Everything's fine. I just wanted to talk." They sat on the fence rail together, looking out over land that rolled toward distant horizons. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermal currents with lazy grace. "I've been thinking about the future," Eliza said, "about what I want to do when I'm 18 and legally an adult. And? I want to stay here, help run the ranch, maybe eventually take over some of the management." She glanced at him. "If that's all right with you." Caleb's expression shifted through surprise to something that looked like pride. "You don't have to decide that now. You've got time to figure out what you want." "I know, but I've been watching how you run things, learning the books from Martha, understanding what makes this place work. I'm good at it, and I want to build something lasting, something that can support all of us." "What about your sisters?" "Catherine wants to be a teacher. She's already talking about it with Miss Hendricks. Margaret wants to write, maybe become a journalist. Ruth's too young to know yet, but whatever she chooses, we'll support it." Eliza looked at him directly. "We're not going anywhere, Caleb. This is home. We want to build our lives here." The emotion that crossed Caleb's face was complex, joy and grief mixed together, the happiness of found family tangled with the pain of the one he'd lost. "Sarah would have liked you," he said quietly. "All of you. She always wanted this house full of children, full of life. We can't replace what you lost. You're not replacing anything. You're creating something new." Caleb cleared his throat. "And if you want to learn ranch management, I'll teach you everything I know." They rode back together as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The house came into view, smoke rising from the chimney where Martha was helping Margaret with dinner. Ruth's laughter carried from somewhere near the barn where she was playing with Jack. Catherine sat on the porch steps, reading a book in the fading light. It was a scene of such ordinary domesticity that it might have been unremarkable anywhere else. But for 5 people who'd been torn apart by loss and nearly destroyed by a system that saw children as commodities, it was nothing short of miraculous. That evening, they gathered for dinner around the table that had become the center of their life together. The food was simple but good. The conversation ranged from school gossip to ranch business to plans for the summer. Arguments broke out over trivial things and were resolved with laughter. Ruth spilled her milk and was comforted rather than scolded. It was messy and chaotic and imperfect and absolutely everything they'd needed. After dinner, as had become their custom, Margaret read aloud. Tonight's selection was a new book Miss Hendricks had lent her, something about adventure and discovery and finding yourself in unexpected places. Her voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the prose, carrying them all into another world for a little while. But this time, when Eliza looked around the room, she didn't feel the need to escape into fiction. Reality, this improbable family they'd built from the wreckage of their separate tragedies, was more than enough. When the reading finished and the younger girls headed upstairs to bed, Eliza remained in the parlor with Caleb. The fire had burned low, and the house had settled into that particular quiet of evening, drawing toward night. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "what would have happened if you'd arrived at that auction 5 minutes later? If you'd missed it entirely?" "Every day," Caleb admitted. "But then I remember that dwelling on what-ifs doesn't change what is. We're here, we're together, we're building something that matters. Do you think it'll last? This happiness we've found?" "Nothing lasts forever, Eliza. But that doesn't make it less real or less valuable." Caleb stood, stretched, moved to bank the fire for the night. "We've got today. We've got each other. We've got a future we're building together. That's more than most people get." He was right, Eliza realized. They'd been given something precious, not because they deserved it, or because life owed them compensation for suffering, but because sometimes, in the midst of systemic cruelty and human indifference, one person decided to care when it would have been easier to walk away. Months turned into years, and the sharp edges of trauma gradually wore smooth. Not forgotten, never forgotten, but integrated into who they became, rather than defining their entire existence. Catherine did become a teacher, taking over Miss Hendricks' position when the older woman retired. She taught with particular attention to children who seemed lost or afraid, remembering what it felt like to be both. Margaret became a journalist, her articles about social reform and child welfare reaching audiences far beyond Kansas. She used her words to create change, to expose injustice, to give voice to the voiceless. Ruth grew into a young woman of remarkable compassion, studying medicine with the goal of helping people who couldn't afford traditional care. She remembered being vulnerable and scared, and she dedicated her life to protecting others from that same fear. And Eliza ran the ranch with Caleb, eventually becoming an equal partner in the operation. She married eventually, a good man who understood that her first loyalty would always be to her sisters and the found family that had saved them all. She raised children of her own in the house that had once been a tomb, filling it with the noise and chaos and overwhelming love that Sarah Whitmore had dreamed of. The Foster Care Protection Act that their testimony had helped pass became a model for other territories and eventually states, changing the landscape of child welfare across the growing nation. Their personal tragedy became the foundation for systemic change that protected thousands of children who would never know the Moore sisters' names, but benefited from their courage. Vernon Hayes drank himself to death 3 years after losing the court case, dying alone and unmourned in a boarding house in a different town. They learned of his death from a brief notice in the newspaper. None of them attended the funeral. They'd long since stopped wasting energy on anger toward a man who'd proven himself unworthy of their emotional investment. The men who'd tried to intimidate them during that long night faced consequences. Reeves spent 6 months in jail for trespassing and threatening minors, and his reputation never recovered. Turnbull lost his boarding house when his workers finally rebelled against his exploitation. Porter, the slick lawyer, was eventually disbarred for unrelated ethical violations. Justice wasn't always poetic, but sometimes it was sufficient. Years later, when reporters came to interview the Moore sisters about the landmark legislation they'd helped create, Eliza would stand on the porch of the ranch that had become her home and tell the story one more time. Not because she enjoyed reliving it, but because she understood that her pain had purchased something valuable, the safety of children she'd never meet, in circumstances she couldn't predict, protected by laws she'd helped create. "What would you say to the Eliza standing on that auction platform?" a reporter asked during one such interview. Eliza thought about that 17-year-old girl, terrified and defiant, holding her sisters close and waiting for the worst. "I'd tell her that she's stronger than she knows, That help is coming in a form she won't expect. That the future holds more than just survival. It holds the possibility of joy, of family, of making her suffering mean something beyond just her own experience. And to girls facing similar situations now, that they're not alone, that systems can be changed, that one person caring enough to act can alter the trajectory of lives. That family isn't just about blood, it's about who shows up, who fights for you, who refuses to let you face the darkness alone. When Caleb died, peacefully, in his sleep, at the age of 73, the funeral filled the church with people whose lives he'd touched in ways large and small. The 4 sisters he'd saved stood together at the graveside, middle-aged women now, with families and accomplishments and scars they'd learned to wear with dignity. They buried him next to Sarah, finally reuniting the couple that death had separated. And on the headstone, beneath his name and dates, they added an epitaph that captured who he'd been. He saw injustice and refused to walk past. He saved 4 strangers and found a family. He proved that one person's courage can change the world. The ranch continued under Eliza's management, eventually passing to her children and nieces and nephews. The house that had been built for Sarah's dream of a large family finally fulfilled that purpose, sheltering multiple generations who grew up knowing the story of how their grandmother and great-aunts had been saved by a man who couldn't stomach watching children be sold like livestock. The auction platform in Millbrook was torn down the year after the Foster Care Protection Act passed. Its lumber used to build an addition to the school. A small plaque marked where it had stood, a reminder of what had been legal and what should never have been acceptable. And on quiet evenings, when the light slanted golden across the Kansas plains, and the world felt both fragile and eternal, descendants of the Moore sisters would gather on that same porch where Eliza had once sat processing trauma and building hope, and they'd tell the story again. Not as tragedy, though it had started that way. Not as miracle, though it had felt miraculous at the time, but as something more nuanced and more powerful, as evidence that systems could be changed, that individual action mattered, that family was something you built rather than something you were simply born into. They'd tell the story of 4 girls who'd stood on an auction block and refused to be broken, of a man who'd acted when walking away would have been easier, of a community that had eventually rallied around what was right instead of what was traditional, of laws that changed because people demanded better. And they'd tell it not as ancient history, but as living legacy, a reminder that every generation faces moments when they must choose between convenience and justice, between tradition and progress, between walking past suffering and standing up to stop it. The story of the Moore sisters and Caleb Whitmore became part of the fabric of American child welfare reform, studied in classrooms and cited in legal briefs and remembered in families where someone had been saved because laws had changed and systems had evolved. But more than that, it became proof of something essential and enduring. That in a world that often treats the vulnerable as disposable, the choice to care, to actually give a damn about what happens to strangers, can ripple forward through time in ways impossible to measure, but impossible to deny. 4 girls sold at auction. 1 man who refused to accept it. A family built from the wreckage of separate tragedies. And a future that was different, better, more just because they'd all chosen to fight rather than accept that the world had to be the way it was. That was the story. And it was enough.